"That's it, I've had enough of this. I'm filing for divorce," said the wife to her husband. At these words, the husband became numb. "That's it. I can't live with Nick anymore. I'm filing for divorce." Anastasia sat in her sister Nayli's kitchen and complained about her husband. "I can't take it anymore. I've lived with him for 28 years, and now everything about Nick annoys me. The way he eats, the way he sleeps, the way he walks around the apartment in his slippers. I can't stand him anymore. I want to live for myself for the rest of my years." "Anastasia, what will you do with the apartment?" Nayli asked anxiously. "I don't think it's possible to exchange it without paying extra. You can't throw Nick out on the street. He has a share in the apartment too. You'll live like neighbors in a communal apartment? How are we living now?" Anastasia was indignant. "After my daughter got married and moved in with her husband, Nick lives in one room and I live in the other. Only I still wash his clothes, cook his meals, clean on weekends, and he comes home from work and falls on the couch. Never once cleared a plate off the table. Do you know how much money he makes?" Anastasia grinned. "I'm ashamed to say. How many times have I told him, change jobs, but the only thing I've heard is, I'm fine with it, and I'm sick of carrying everything on my shoulders." "Oh, I don't know what to tell you." Nayli shook her head. "It's hard to live alone, too. I know how it is. When my Matthew was alive, I didn't like a lot of things about him either. And when he was gone, it was as if the light had faded." "I won't be alone," Anastasia said nonchalantly. "And if I don't meet another man, it's okay. Without a man, too, you can do just fine. Remember how in the movie Girls the main character said, 'I decided not to marry at all. One is calmer, I want lackeys. I want gingerbread.' But you loved Nick once, didn't you?" Nayli shook her head. "Even scandalized her mother and threatened to leave home if she did not allow you to marry a colleague Titov. You didn't listen to anyone and did it your own way. You could have talked her out of it." Anastasia looked angrily at her sister. "Maybe my life would have turned out differently." "You're telling me." Nayli shook her head again. "If you've got it in your head, no one can change your mind. It's bath time." Nayli got up from her chair. "Let's have a steam. It'll get the crap out of our heads." Anastasia stood up and stretched. "I need to warm up my bones, because my back has been aching lately before the bath." Anastasia went out into the yard and sat down on a bench that stood near the Pamiatnik. It's a pity they sold her parents' house, she thought, looking across the street. It would be a good place to come back to. She grinned. "I can't live in the country again. I was used to city life. And I needed the money. I'd just gotten a 2-room apartment. I had to furnish it. The money from the sale of my parents' house came in handy. And we spent it on a car. I wanted to please the man I loved," Anastasia grumbled, deciding to get some fresh air. Nayli came out of the anteroom. Breathe. You don't have this in the city. It's all chemistry. When I come to the city, I get a headache. How do you live there?" "I've lived in the country all my life and I'm not going anywhere. Call me a hillbilly. I was born here, I'll die here." "Yeah, life has flown by and I haven't even lived it yet," Anastasia sighed, squinting against the bright sun. "I just got married and had a daughter, and I might be a grandmother soon." Anastasia had known Nick since she was a little girl. He was best friends with her older brother Andrew. They went to school together, went swimming at the river, and raced bicycles. Benjamin always tried to follow Andrew, but he always chased him home and even swore at him. But Anastasia didn't care. She was secretly in love with Dan Titov, who seemed much older than her brother and did not even hide from anyone that he was already smoking cigarettes, although he was barely 14 years old. The sun's rays penetrated through the curtains, waking Nick from a deep sleep. He took after his father. He grumbled to his mother, Rosalie. "I suppose he's going to end up with an alcoholic and a companion like Dan. Good thing Carla got rid of her husband. He'd frozen to death outside his house drunk in the winter. They found him in the morning." Anastasia paid no attention to her mother's nagging, continuing to stare at Nick with loving eyes. Except that to him she was still little, as he called her, even though she was only 2 years younger. When Andrew left for the army, Nick was taken too. Anastasia wrote letters to her brother, saying hello to Nick, and was very happy when in a return letter her brother wrote back to her saying that Nick sends his warm army greetings to you too. After graduating from the 8th grade, Anastasia decided to enter the culinary school, although her mother suggested that she go to the city and apply to the trade school. But she did not want to go far from home, because in a year were to return from the army Andrew and Nick Thompson. Nayli had married by then, moved into her husband's house, and was expecting her second child. She rarely visited her mother and sister, because she had no time to be with her own family. In the evenings, Anastasia and her mother dreamed that when Andrew returned from service he would marry Vivian. Although Vivian, who faithfully waited for him from the army all 2 years, she sometimes ran to Anastasia, bragged that she had thought up the style of the wedding dress, and white shoes, which she and her mother bought in the city department store, were already lying in the closet in a cardboard box, waiting for the celebration. When Andrew and I have a baby, Vivian said cheerfully, "You'll be his godmother. I want a son to be the firstborn." She rolled her eyes dreamily. "And then we can have a couple of girls. But the main thing is that the first must be a son." "Oh, you're dreaming." Rosalie looked affectionately at the future daughter-in-law. "It's hard to manage with 3 children." "I know myself nothing. I am strong," laughed Vivian. "And with a husband like Andrew, I can do everything." Vivian continued to dream. "He grew up caring, hardworking, and handsome. Other girls envy me that a guy like him could love me. You'd think I was ugly." "Oh, no," Rosalie shook her head. "You and my Andrew are a very good couple, and I'm very glad you're getting married. We just have to wait a few months until he comes back, and then we'll want a wedding like this. 3 days of celebration. If only my Anastasia could find a good groom. Then I'd have peace of mind for all my children," Rosalie sighed. But her mother, embarrassed, Anastasia ran off to the other room. Rosalie and Vivian laughed loudly. But the dreams were not destined to come true. A month before the end of the service, Andrew died. No one knows how it happened. Or rather, the command, of course, knew the circumstances of his death, but said only one thing: an accident. From grief, Rosalie in a flash grayed and could not believe that in a closed coffin is her son Andrew. "It's not him, not him." She wailed at the cemetery, watching the grave mound grow. "I just recently received a letter from Andrew, in which he wrote that he would soon return home." "Mom, calm down," Anastasia, clinging to her mother, trembling with all her body, begged. "Let's go to the wake. Everyone's already there." Rosalie swore after her daughter, turning to look at the fresh grave where her only son lay. Soon Nick returned from the army and, without going home, went straight to the Martyanovs. Seeing him, Rosalie splashed her hands, hugged Nick, and wept bitter tears. "You tell me that my Andrew is alive." The woman looked hopefully at Nick. "We saw you off to the service together, so you must return together. Tell me that you deceived me, brought to the coffin of another man's son." "No," Aunt Rosa. Nick shook his head. "Not deceived." He sighed heavily. "I'm sorry." Bye. Nick quickly went out into the yard, sat down on a bench, and lit a cigarette. Nick didn't notice how Anastasia silently walked over to him and sat down next to him. "Welcome back," she said quietly. But Nick shuddered with surprise. "Oh, I'm scared." He almost dropped his cigarette and smiled. "Wow, how you have grown, quite a bride has become." "How did Andrew die?" Anastasia asked quietly again, staring off into the distance. "I don't know," Nick answered hastily. "I was on leave that day, and when I returned to the unit, I was told that Andrew..." He was silent again. "In short, that Andrew is no longer there, and no one explained the reasons to me. You know, the army, there is a lot of secrecy." In fact, Nick lied. He knew that his best friend died because of him, and now he was tormented by conscience. On another leave, Nick met a girl and started dating her, but she had an older brother who was strongly against it. He warned Nick that if he did not get away from Grace, he would be in big trouble. But Nick only grinned, saying that nothing would scare him. On that fateful day, Nick and Andrew walked out of the unit together to go about their business. Nick was excited about his date with Grace, and Andrew decided to buy gifts for his family. After all, he was about to be discharged soon, and he wanted to return home not empty-handed. They had barely rounded the corner of the concrete fence when they ran into a group of guys, including Grace's older brother Benjamin. He looked at Nick sternly. "I warned you to back off my sister. Well, now hold on." Benjamin swung and hit Nick with all his might, who fell to the ground. But he jumped up and came at him. A fight ensued. Andrew could not stay away and rushed to help his friend. Benjamin took a knife out of his pocket and wanted to stab Nick with it. But it so happened that the knife hit Andrew right in the heart, and he fell down. Everyone froze, not expecting such an ending. "Cops!" shouted Benjamin, and the boys scattered. Nick ran after them. He wandered around the city for a long time and returned to the unit only in the evening. There he was told that Private Andrew Mardyanov was killed. There were no more details. Nick was interrogated, as it should be, because he was seen leaving the unit together with Andrew. But he, afraid that he could go to the brig, said that as soon as he and Andrew went out of the gate, they went in different directions. And he knows nothing more. Until the end of the service, Nick was afraid that the command of the unit guessed that Andrew died because of him, and even stopped going on leave. But everything went well. He was no longer summoned for interrogation. And now, looking at Anastasia, he felt ashamed of her and Aunt Rosa, that they had lost a son and a brother. "It's me," Nick got up from the bench. "If you need anything, contact me to help with the household or something else. After all, Andrew and I were best friends. I, so to speak, will help you." "Thank you," Anastasia looked at him gratefully. "And then Mom says that we are completely without male hands left. Even digging the vegetable garden is now no one." "Not a problem," Nick said. "I'll come to you tomorrow morning." But in the morning, Nick did not show up. All night he celebrated his return with his friends, and in the morning he was hungover. He went to bed and slept through the night. "So where is your assistant?" Rosa asked her youngest daughter snidely. "I guess I shouldn't have praised her yesterday that Nick would help us with everything. I'll have to go back to Jake's house again. He'll do anything for a bottle. Last time he dug our garden so hard, nothing grew. But there's no way out. I don't have any strength left. And look at you. Skinny, you can't hold a shovel." "Mom, you'll see." "Nick will come," said Anastasia, looking out the window. "He promised to help us in everything instead of Andrew." "Oh, Andrew, my darling son." Rosalie wailed. "And who did you leave us for?" Anastasia did not listen to her mother and ran out of the house. She walked along the country road and, reaching the house where the Titovs lived, looked through the fence into the yard. Aunt Carla was doing chores, and Nick was nowhere to be seen. "Something's peeking out," Helia Swan, Nick's friend, sneaked up on her. "Why don't you come inside?" "I'm not looking at anything," Anastasia replied fearfully. "I was just passing by and stopped for a moment to catch my breath." "Well, well, well," laughed Helia. "And I already thought that you decided to visit some fiancé? After all, we haven't seen each other for 2 years. Probably missed you." He laughed out loud again. "It's too much." Anastasia stepped away from the fence and walked away. But she heard Helia enter the house and shouted loudly, "Nick, stop snoozing, you already have brides waiting for you at the gate." Anastasia blushed and walked even faster towards her house. She thought that Nick had forgotten his promise. And what was her surprise when, waking up in the morning, she went out into the yard and saw him in the garden with a shovel in his hands. "Come on, show me which beds to dig." He squinted against the bright sun. "Sorry, I couldn't come yesterday. I was celebrating my return from the army. You should understand." "I understand," Anastasia nodded her head. "You dig, and I have to get ready. I'm going to miss the bus." "Where are you going this early in the morning?" Nick wondered. "Are you in a hurry to go on a date?" "What date?" Anastasia laughed. "At the school, I go to class in the morning and then come home in the afternoon. I was offered a dorm room, but I turned it down. How can I leave my mom alone? I've been driving back and forth all week." Good thing it's vacation soon, I won't have to go anywhere. Be careful. Nick grumbled. And if anyone hurts you, tell me right away. Oh, who needs me? Anastasia was embarrassed, but she was glad that Nick was worried about her. From that time, Nick began to come sometimes to the Martyanovs that fence fixes, or the doors in the barn. Mom, look, what a hard worker, Nick, said Anastasia with delight. He's helping us like he promised. Yes, Rosalie said. But that hard worker always smells so bad that it's impossible to stand next to him. So what? Anastasia shrugged. A man can have a drink after work, can't he? Oh, Anastasia, Rosalie shook her head. You're still young, you don't understand a lot of things. If a man drinks, it's bad for the family. The wife, the children, and the rest of the family suffer. Look at our neighbors, Timofeevs. Their Pete's been drinking as long as I've known him. His wife Nancy has come to our house barefoot and with babies to escape her husband's wrath. Why doesn't Aunt Nancy divorce Pete? Anastasia asked in surprise. Why should she put up with such an attitude? Where would she go? Rosalie sighed. She's got 2 kids on her hands, and now she's pregnant with her 3rd. She has no help from anyone. Her parents are dead. She will endure her husband's antics for the rest of her life. And she loves that alcoholic. She admitted it herself. No, I couldn't do that, Anastasia shook her head. I would have filed for divorce right away. Easy to say, but hard to do, Rosalie grinned. Not every woman would decide to get a divorce. And we don't like divorced women. Even if she were a widow. There's nothing you can do, fate. But divorced women are like some kind of lepers. You can't invite them to your house. She may look back at another man's man. It's medieval, Anastasia laughed. We passed in school. I do not remember in which country, but if a husband died, they killed his wife and buried her next to him. And in another country, I don't remember which one, if an older brother died, the younger brother got his wife, Anastasia continued. And no one asked if he wanted to marry her or not. Holy, holy. Rosalie crossed herself on the icon. Such wild customs. Thank God we do not have such a thing. In the fall, Nick decided to go to the city. He got a job and now he rarely came to the village, and Anastasia became sad. Every weekend at a certain time she passed by the stop where the bus stopped, hoping to see Nick. But alas, her expectations were in vain. A year later she graduated from college and got a job in a canteen. One day she was returning from work and saw Nick walking towards her. Oh, Anastasia. Nick. He looked at her. You look different. You look so much prettier. I didn't even recognize you at first. How are you? I'm not married yet, Anastasia said, embarrassed. What about you? You haven't gotten married? I'm going to. Nick grinned. I've come to choose a bride. Pick a bride? Anastasia asked. Didn't you find one in town? No, not in the city, Nick grinned. There are too many demands. They give flowers, candy, gifts, and in general they're kind of spoiled. You have to take care of them, bring coffee in bed. Ugh. He spat on the ground. A wife should take care of a man, feed him, do his laundry, understand? Not the other way around. That's how it is in our village. The man is the master of the house, and the wife must obey him in everything. That's why I decided to choose a bride from the locals. Why do you want to get married? Anastasia was surprised, and even so urgently. Nick lit a cigarette. I now work at the factory. I live in a dormitory. And they say that families can get an apartment. So I decided to get married, to get a separate place. And then I can get a divorce. No one will take my apartment away from me. He looked Anastasia over from head to toe. By the way, would you marry me? Nick asked. You're not a spoiled girl, you're not spoiled. You won't claim my apartment. So will you marry me? Or should I give you time to think about it? No, Anastasia shook her head quickly, not believing her happiness. I'll do it. Well, that's the deal. Nick looked at his watch. We'll have a proper wedding. Or, they will start to talk in the village. Come on, get ready. And I'll tell my mother to call the guests. I'll leave the money for her for a treat. and I'll come again in a month. You and I are getting married. Well, I gotta go. I gotta go see my friends again. Tell them I've decided to say goodbye to the single life. He was walking down a dusty road. Anastasia wasn't just walking home, she was flying on wings. Mom. She ran into the house and ran to her mother. I'm getting married. Nick Titov proposed to me. And fathers. Rosalie splashed her hands. Are you crazy? No, I won't let you. I won't let you marry him to spoil your fate. He's no good for you. Don't you get it? Tears came to Anastasia's eyes. I've loved Nick for a long time, since I was a little girl, she said. I never dreamed I'd be his wife, and if you forbid me to marry him, I'll leave home and you'll never see me again. I'll go to town with Nick and we'll get married there anyway. You'll be stuck with him all your life, Rosalie sighed. He's a fool. Can't you see that? I love him, she said, stomping her foot. And you can't stop me. What can I do with you? Rosalie sighed. You're just like your father, just as stubborn. Don't complain later, Anastasia. Complain about what? Anastasia was genuinely surprised. I'm going to have the happiest family because I'm marrying the man I love. Love. Rosalie grinned. You love him, but he loves you. Why did he suddenly decide to marry you? You've never met, never courted each other. He must have something to gain. No one's going to miss out, said Rosalie. There's something wrong with him. Mama, Nick is very good, said Anastasia, and twirled round her mother. Oh, I'm so happy. I'm going to tell Vivian about the wedding. Let her envy me. What can you do now? Rosalie resigned herself to it. Maybe it would work out for them. The wedding in the village was merry. The tables were set in the courtyard of the Titov's house, lavished with lavish whores, d'oeuvres, and alcohol. Anastasia sat at the head of the table next to Nick and smiled happily. And he seemed to pay no attention to his wife, only wrinkled and reluctantly kissed her when the guests shouted loudly bitter. Oh, Anastasia. Vivian, who had been a bridesmaid, moved toward her. You're going to regret getting married. He doesn't look at you at all, as if you weren't his wife at all. He drinks moonshine with his friends and looks at other girls. He's not used to me yet, Anastasia defended her husband. Wait, we will live together, then he will not let me out of his sight. Until then, let him drink and have fun. It's a wedding, not a funeral. Then let's have a drink with you. Vivian handed her a glass of champagne. To love. And lots of kids. Oh, come on. Anastasia waved her hand and took a sip of champagne, but it went down the wrong throat. Tears came to her eyes. Would you say kids too? We can't think about them yet, and we have to get settled in the city first. Nick will soon get an apartment from the factory. You'll have to furnish it, you'll be a city girl. Vivian looked enviously at her friend. You'll forget the village altogether, she said. You know, probably even stop coming here. Don't be silly. Anastasia was angry. My mother is here, my sister, my nephews. How could I forget them? Nick and I will often come to help with the household chores. While Anastasia was talking to her friend, Nick got up from the table and went somewhere with friends, taking with him a bottle of moonshine. Noticing that the bride was almost crying, her mother-in-law came to her, took her by the hand and led her into the house. Let's go and rest, said Rosalie. You must be tired for the day. I've made a bed for you in the back room so that no one will disturb you. What about the guests? Anastasia looked around in confusion. Them Aunt Carla laughed. They've already forgotten about you. As long as there is moonshine and snacks on the table, and the bride and groom are not so important. Lie down and rest. Where's Nick? Anastasia sat on the bed and looked sadly at her mother-in-law. Kolka, don't wait, she sighed. Now, probably on the river with his friends drinking. He's like his father. I too waited for my husband all night after the wedding feast. I sat on the bed like you. I shed bitter tears. And then I didn't live a sweet life. Oh, she waved her hand. What to say now? Life is lived, not Washington. She waved again and left the room. Anastasia got out of bed and walked to the window, beyond which it was already dark. She could hear drunken voices. Someone belted out a song, and the disorderly voices backed it up. It's going to be different for me, Anastasia thought. She took off her white dress and placed it carefully on the table, then lay down on the bed, covered herself with the blanket and closed her eyes. She fell asleep immediately and woke up to someone piling on top of her. Anastasia screamed, but a wide palm covered her mouth. "What are you yelling for? Are you going to wake up the whole house?" She heard Nick's voice. "Didn't you recognize your husband?" He continued to pile on top of her. "Don't." Anastasia tried to say, but she failed. "Come on," Nick poked her with his breath. "You're my wife now and you should know your duties. Or didn't your mother tell you anything about them?" He laughed. "Come on, do not break. Or I'll go find another woman for myself. There are plenty of them in the village. Who would not refuse a man's caress?" Anastasia obeyed in silence. Her lip was bleeding and she prayed to God that it would all be over quickly. In the morning, the guests gathered again in the Titov's yard. Anastasia no longer sat at the table, but as hostess, she brought the treats, washed the dishes, and watched Nick, who again had fun with his friends, forgetting that he had a young wife. And at night he was again pestering Anastasia, and she silently tolerated everything, only furtively wiping away her tears. A couple days later, Nick went into town for work. "I gotta go," he mumbled as he put on his shirt. "What about me?" Anastasia looked at her husband in bewilderment. "I have to pack. I have to quit my job. There's no reason for you to come with me now. I'll get an apartment, we'll get settled, and then I'll call you to me. And this. Give me your marriage license. I have to show them at work that I'm a married man now." "Nick, when are you coming to pick me up?" Anastasia was almost crying. "I mean, we just got married. What will people say? He left his young wife at home and went to the city." "But you do not listen to anyone." Nick counted the money and stuffed it into the inside pocket of his jacket. "I'll settle down and take you to the city. So tell all the curious people. Let them figure out the rest." "Let me at least walk you to the bus." Anastasia jumped out of bed and started to get dressed. "I'll walk myself." Nick looked at her angrily. "And you help my mother. Don't be lazy." "Maybe I'll go to my house for a while," Anastasia suggested timidly. "I don't feel comfortable living here without you." "As you wish," Nick shrugged. "Okay, I gotta go. The bus won't wait." He didn't kiss his wife goodbye. Nick walked out the door and walked briskly to the gate. Anastasia hoped he would turn around and wave at her, but Nick didn't even look back. She cried a little, and then gathered up all her things and went back to her mother's house. "What have you done?" Rosalie shook her hands when she saw her daughter. "Mom, stop it," Anastasia cut her off. "Nick went to the city alone to get an apartment," Anastasia said. "As soon as he's settled, he'll come and get me, and we'll leave." Yeah, Rosalie said, her thin lips tightening. "Words and words go here and there, but deeds go nowhere. Well, I've been married, so maybe I'm happy now. We'll live like we used to. If Nick wanted you, he'd have taken you with him instead of embarrassing you in front of people." "Nick will come for me," Anastasia said, resenting her mother. "And if I'm bothering you, I can go back to my mother-in-law's. It's my house there now, too." "Live already," Rosalie sighed. "If you're back, we'll see." A week passed, another week, another month, and there was no word from Nick. Anastasia ran to the mailbox every day, hoping to see a letter from him. But she found nothing in the mailbox except the newspaper her mother had written. From acquaintances, she learned that Nick has already received an apartment, in which he now lives alone, and he doesn't even think of coming to the village. "If that's the case, I'll go to him myself," she told her mother at breakfast. "I'll get the address and then I'll go." "Go?" Rosalie shrugged. "It doesn't seem very human. You're here and your husband's in town. I don't know what he's doing there." She put the food on her daughter's plate. Anastasia picked up a fork and picked up a piece of scrambled egg, but suddenly she turned pale and ran out into the yard, clamping her mouth shut. I see Rosalie sighed as Anastasia returned to the table. Now I guess I'll have to go into town to deal with your man. Mom, what are you talking about? Anastasia looked at her in surprise. You're pregnant, that's what. Rosalie shook her head. It's no big deal. There was no sorrow. Well, it can't be helped now. I won't let you disgrace yourself. She tied a kerchief on her head, went outside and headed for the Titov's house. Anastasia, did you fall asleep while playing Six in the Sun? Anastasia opened her eyes and saw Nelly holding a birch broom. No, Anastasia stretched. I remembered my life, how I had married a penny, how I had moved to the city to live with him. If it hadn't been for my mother, I would have been alone with my daughter in my arms. Our mother was a brave woman, Nelly smiled. She's remembered fondly. She never told me what she said to your Nick when she found him in town, but he came to the village like a sweetheart and took you with him. But she was very worried about you. She felt in her motherly heart that you weren't living well with your husband. How many times I told her not to tear her heart out. Did she listen to anyone? At least you didn't say anything when you came to visit, but kept quiet. What kind of husband and father would Nick make? What else could I say? Anastasia lowered her eyes. It was my own fault for not listening to my mother and marrying him. I've been tormented all my life. Now she cried out. All right, enough of this damp. Nelly rubbed her lower back. Go and collect the laundry while I make a broom for the bath. It's good for you, okay? You'll forget all your sorrows in no time when you take a broom bath. They say a broom is worth more than money in a bathhouse. Having undressed in the anteroom, Anastasia went into the steam room and squeezed her eyes shut with pleasure. It was really good and smelled of tar. She poured hot water into a basin and diluted it with cold water, pouring it generously from the ladle. Then she put the boiling water on the stone and, steaming with the broom, began to whip herself on her back and sides, saying, as her mother Rosalie had once said, gula on the back, that they may run away, gula on the legs, so that they run along the paths, gula on the shoulders so you can sleep at night. Anastasia doused herself with cool water and went into the anteroom to catch her breath. Then she went back into the steam room to wash herself properly. When she returned home after the bath, she laid down on the bed with her arms spread out. Oh, it feels so good, she said with ease, as if she had been born again. I left some compote in a cup for you on the table, said Nelly, taking the clean linen. I'll go and wash off the dirt and fatigue. Our mother used to say that scented steam not only heals the body but also the soul, not your city baths, which are of little use. While Nelly washed in the bath, Anastasia even took a nap, woken by the slamming of the front door. Rested, she made her way to her room. A flushed Nelly walked in. I'll be right back, and then we'll sit down to dinner. At dinner, the sisters drank a shot or two of moonshine, snacking on salted meat that lay appetizingly on the plate. Maybe he'll change his mind about getting a divorce. Nelly waved her hands again. What do you have to divide now? We've lived and lived. Soon you'll have grandchildren. Will there be a sense in life? It won't, Anastasia said. I'm tired, Nelly. I'm exhausted. I haven't bumped into the back of a chair. I've loved my Nick for so many years, and now suddenly I'm tired. What happened? Nothing much happened, Anastasia sighed. It's been building up for years. I'd reached the end of my patience. He quit 6 months ago, didn't he? Nelly looked at her sister in surprise. You said he'd never had a drop in his mouth. How much did he drink before that? Anastasia grinned. As long as I can remember, he drank as much as he did. As if you hadn't noticed. Nelly got up from the table and began to collect the dishes. When you married Nick, your mother and I told you he was following in his father's footsteps, but you wouldn't even listen to us. I thought he'd change with me. Anastasia looked sadly out the window. I thought that if I surrounded him with love and care, he'd forget about drinking. Only the hunchback can be fixed by the grave. Nelly said with a sneer. And your colleague will not even help. Why didn't you divorce and leave Nick right away? If life with him didn't work out, you had a place to go back to. My mom was still alive. And after she died, they didn't sell the house right away, she sighed. It was a shame to go back. And Nick loved my daughter. I couldn't deprive her of her own father. When he was sober, he was happy to take her for walks and bring her goodies. And when she went to school, he could help her with her homework. By that time, we already had a one-bedroom apartment, and we sold the house with you parents, and the money was divided. So I used the money to furnish the apartment. It's a sight to behold. I couldn't just leave it and go anywhere. It was a pity. Don't you feel sorry for your life? Nayli sat down at the table across from her sister again. I worked hard, from morning till night in the canteen to earn an extra penny. Kolia, where did they transfer your son because of his drunkenness to different laborers? He didn't last long there either. You had to carry everything on your shoulders to support your family. At least you could carry some food home from the canteen. You're right, Anastasia sighed. My older co-workers pitied me. They'd put butter in my bag, or a piece of meat, or fruit for my daughter. Nick was drinking most of his paycheck, so I had to cut back on everything. Thanks, Nayli. You helped me by sending me a sack of potatoes, onions, pickles, homemade eggs. That's how we survived. I kept hoping that Nick would improve, get a job, and we'd live like human beings. But alas, Anastasia waved her hands. All my hopes were dashed. When my daughter lived with us, Nick and I still had something in common. And when she went to college and moved to another city, that's when I realized we were strangers. Before that, it was like I didn't notice anything. It was like there was a veil over my eyes. I forgave him for scandals, drunkenness, insults, the eternal lack of money. He even tried to raise his hand against me, but I couldn't stand it. I remember I grabbed a knife from the table, which I used to cut cabbage. Anastasia continued. And how God kept me from sinning, I don't know. But Nick got scared, and from then on he only insulted me with words. You poor, poor thing. Nayli came to her sister and put her arm around her shoulders. All these years you've put up with it, and you haven't told me much. You had enough problems of your own, didn't you? Anastasia waved her hand. I buried a tyrant husband. My son started fooling around. Good thing he came to his senses in time, and I'm still here with my complaints. I put up with it. Somehow I kept hoping for the best. So what's changed? Nayli repeated her question. I've changed. Anastasia ran a hand through her hair. Since I got the other job, I've changed. I didn't notice anything before. Work, home, work. And I had the worst job in the world. I was running around like a squirrel in a wheel. I would get up early, then spend the whole day at the hot stove with smoking pots. And in the evening I could barely get home from fatigue. She'd go back to the stove. I had to cook dinner. And as I got a job in a pastry shop, which opened not far from home, and more free time appeared. And I looked at my colleagues, girls young, well-groomed, with arrows and hairstyles, and I am among them, like an old woman of 100 years. I felt ashamed. I started to earn more money and save it. I used to spend everything on groceries to feed my family better, but he got so brazen that he turned his face away from my food. He said it wasn't good. You could overdo it for your own husband. I was upset by such words and tried even harder to cook something delicious. One day I cooked a chicken, which turned out so brown with a delicious flavor. Nick, as usual, put a chicken leg on his plate and ate a little. Then he put the second one on his plate, took a little bite from different sides and pushed the plate away, saying he was full, but there was a lot of chicken meat left on the bones. When I saw that, I even cried. I always liked to eat chicken leg, but I rarely got it. I used to save it for my husband or my daughter. And I used to eat white meat, which I've hated all my life, Anastasia continued. So I started saving money, and I bought dumplings or put pasta and cutlets on the table. Nick threw the plates on the floor at first. But eventually he realized that I wasn't going to indulge him anymore. He ate every last crumb, going days without dinner. And I slowly renewed my closet, got rid of old clothes, and 3 years ago for the first time went to the sea with a colleague who went there every year. Can you imagine? Nayli, for the first time in so many years I saw the sea so warm and gentle. On vacation I enjoyed everything like a child, and I did not care that we rented some shed where there were only 2 beds with iron nets and sold mattresses. And all the amenities were in the yard. I then the whole year lived the memories of this vacation, and the next year again went to the south, having saved money for tickets. Oh, how Nick called me names before the trip. But I did not care. It was at the resort I felt like a woman, which men can still pay attention to. It was like I spread my wings and even had a little resort romance with no strings attached. Are you planning to go to your resort this year? Nayli grinned. I see you enjoyed it, didn't you? I did. Anastasia nodded her head. I liked feeling like a human being instead of a maid and a housekeeper. Well, it's time for bed. Nayli looked at her watch. I wish you were leaving tomorrow. I'd have stayed a little longer. They wouldn't understand at work, Anastasia said with a smile. The next day, Nayli walked her sister to the bus. You should think again before you make a decision, she said, hugging Anastasia goodbye. It's easy to tear things down, but it's hard to put them back together again. Anastasia nodded silently and walked up the steps to the bus. As she entered the apartment, she nearly tripped over her scattered shoes. Was it really that hard to clean up after yourself? Anastasia grumbled, putting her husband's shoes on the shelf. Nick walked out into the hallway, glaring angrily at his wife. Have you had enough of Dan Holm? Leave me alone, Anastasia shrugged him off. You'd better help me unpack my bags. Nayli's brought her presents, and she seems embarrassed. Is she trying to drag her own sister into her dirty business? Or did she lose her shame and show up with her boyfriend? Anastasia didn't listen to him anymore and went into the kitchen. It was the same as usual when she was away from home. The table was covered in grease stains. The sink was full of dirty dishes, bread crumbs on the floor. It was so hard to clean up after yourself. Anastasia grumbled as she put on her apron. I didn't get married to wash dishes and scrub floors. Nick replied defiantly, that's what women are for. And what are men for? To lie on the couch and scold their wives. Anastasia was silent, gathering her courage. Let's get a divorce. We've been strangers for a long time. Why should we torture each other? Why don't we? Nick answered immediately. I have no doubt in my mind that you'll never do it. Maybe I'm sick of it too. How do you feel about me? I'll find myself a young hottie, and you'll learn how to live without a man. That's the deal, Anastasia exhaled with relief as she began to clean up. We'll split the apartment, and we'll each get our own lives. And I'll finally have an orderly kitchen, not a pigsty like this. Nick looked at his wife resentfully but said nothing. He went to his room and didn't come out until the evening, and when he got hungry, he came to the kitchen and was surprised to find that Anastasia had not cooked anything. Had you forgotten your duties? He literally burst into her room. Do I have to go hungry? Have you forgotten that you and I are getting a divorce? Anastasia didn't even look at him, continuing to flip through the magazine. Learn to live on your own. Cook your own food now. And you're going to wash your own clothes too, by the way. I'm done working for you, Anastasia said. Oh yes, I'm sorry, I forgot that you're divorcing me, Nick said ironically. Good luck. He forcefully slammed the door to the room. Anastasia heard her husband slam the refrigerator door, swearing. Then something rattled and fell, but she didn't even go out to see what he'd dropped. Anastasia went to work in the morning, and on her lunch break, she went to file the divorce papers. She filled out the necessary application, stating in it the reason didn't agree on the characters. The court clerk's office accepted her application and marked it, and said they would send her a notice by mail when she would have to appear in court for a preliminary hearing. When she got home that evening, Anastasia went into the kitchen, poured herself some tea, and made a sandwich. She didn't feel like eating. Out of habit, she pulled a pot out of the cupboard to make dinner, but then suddenly laughed and put the pot back. She went into her room, turned on the TV, lay down on her bed, and closed her eyes. On the TV, a man and a woman were first figuring out their relationship, and then vigorously declaring their love for each other. Anastasia turned off the TV, covered herself with a blanket, and fell asleep until the morning. She didn't hear Nick rattling the dishes in the kitchen, making his own dumplings, and even washing his own plate, which had never happened before. 2 weeks later, Anastasia handed him a subpoena she'd pulled out of the mailbox. What's this? Nick stared at it, looking at the paper. A summons. Anastasia shrugged. We have to appear in court the day after tomorrow. We're going to go to court the day after tomorrow to get a divorce. What, he yelled. You weren't kidding, were you? No, the wife replied calmly. And I also chose a few options for the exchange of our apartment. We'll have to pay extra, of course, but we can live separately. I'm not going anywhere. Nick threw aside the summons. I thought you were joking to scare me. So you're serious about breaking up with me? Nick asked. We lived together for so many years. We raised our daughter, and now you've decided to start a new life. I knew you'd found a man. You're a fool, Nick. Anastasia sighed. Do you have only one thing on your mind? That I'm cheating on you? Are you judging me by yourself? I'll divorce you even if you don't show up in court. We have an adult daughter and no other children. So you and I will be divorced like sweethearts. Nick looked pitifully at his wife. What are you thinking? We had a good life. Yes, I hurt you a little, but you forgive me, and we'll live like before. We're not in our 20s. We don't know how many years we have left. What do we have to share in our old age? What good things have I seen with you? Anastasia turned to Nick. Other people are vacationing together at resorts, shopping together. Husbands help their wives with chores. Where have you and I traveled together besides the village? We've never been anywhere else. You've never taken me to a restaurant or a cafe. You've never given me a single flower in our whole life together. And I've never seen a present from you on my birthday or New Year's Eve. You've only given me scandals on those days. Probably on purpose, so I wouldn't think about presents and flowers. When my sister and I sold my parents' house, I wanted to buy a fur coat with the proceeds. I bought you a car because you've been wanting one for a long time. Even though it's old, it's your own. You call that a normal life? Amelia, I'll make it up to you, Nick babbled. I'll shower you with flowers. You've come to your senses, Anastasia grinned. And he called her Amelia. It's always Anastasia and Anastasia. No, Nick, it's too late. I don't love you anymore. I used to, but now I don't. Nick lowered his head, turned around, and went to his room. After returning from court, Nick went back into his room and sat on the couch with his arms around his head. He remembered the judge's words over and over again. I give you 2 months to reconcile. If at the second hearing you, the defendant, still do not agree to the divorce, you may be divorced without your consent. For the second time in his life, Nick was very scared. The first time was a long time ago, back in the army, when Andrew had been killed and the investigation into the case had begun. But now, when Anastasia decided to break up with him, there in court, Nick looked at his wife with different eyes. He suddenly saw the tired expression on her face, the cross lines on her forehead, the drooping corners of her lips, and he felt unbearably sorry for Anastasia. There was no one closer to him. He suddenly wanted to hug his wife, to hold her close, to confess his love to her for the first time. And he also realized that he would be lost without his ear, sink to the bottom, get drunk and die under some fence. All these years she had taken care of him, nursed him back to health after another binge. Yes, she'd swear, yell, get angry, but she'd never leave him in the lurch. And Rosa's daughter? How will she react to her parents' divorce? Will she want to stay in touch with her father? Something had to be done. Nick got up from the couch and went to the window. But what? Would Anastasia believe his sincere remorse and take back the statement? The next day, when Anastasia got off work, she was surprised to see Nick standing by the car. What are you doing here? She asked, walking up to him. Did something happen? 3. I was driving by and decided to pick you up to take you home. He was obviously embarrassed. Maybe I need to stop at a store or something. You tell me. You don't have to carry all the heavy stuff yourself. You used to ignore the heavy grocery bags I used to bring home. And then my arms would get sore. Anastasia grinned. Okay, let's go home. I've been on my feet all day. Yeah, and she opened the front door and saw a small bouquet of flowers on the seat. Who were these for? Anastasia wondered again. What's the occasion? They're for you. Nick was a little offended. You said I never gave flowers. I decided to buy some, and you're not happy again. Oh, it's too late for that. Anastasia sighed, sitting down on the seat. Still with you, even if you pick me up every day after work. I need to give flowers. Nick didn't say anything, turned the key in the ignition, and slowly pulled away. Anastasia sat next to him, holding a bouquet of flowers, and smiled. The next day in the evening, Rose's daughter walked in on them. "Dad, Mom, I have some news for you," she said, sitting down in her chair. "I don't know whether it will make you happy or sad." "We have news for you too," Anastasia said seriously, and Nick looked at her reproachfully. "Come on, tell us what's happened to you." "Well," laughed Rose, "you're going to be grandparents soon." "Really?" Anastasia came up to her daughter and hugged her. "I'm so happy. Nick, do you hear me?" She turned to her husband. "We're going to be grandparents. Will we have a grandson or granddaughter?" "I don't know," Rose shrugged. "We haven't had an ultrasound yet. It's scheduled for next week. Then we'll know the sex of the baby. What's your news?" Nick looked pleadingly at Anastasia, and she answered with a wave of her hand. "It's nothing much. I'd forgotten about it." When Rose left, Nick approached his wife. "So we have lived to grandchildren." He put his arm around her shoulders. "You know, I was thinking about the fishing trips we used to take when Rose was a teenager. Why don't we go to the lake this weekend? I'll fish, and you can relax in the fresh air, buy some meat, barbecue." "Why?" Anastasia jumped at the idea. "All right, let's go." "I'll make sandwiches, and we'll get some tea in a thermos," Anastasia said. "I want to wander around the grove near the lake and listen to the birds singing." "So we'll go on Saturday," said Nick. "I'll get my fishing rods ready. I think I saw them in the pantry. It's been a long time since I've been fishing." Nick was worried that Anastasia would change her mind about going with him. But on Saturday, she woke up early and got ready for the trip. When Nick came out of his room, she had everything ready: sandwiches and tea in a thermos. She even fried cutlets, boiled eggs and sausages. Out in nature, you always work up an appetite. The fish have already waited for you, and you still sleep and sleep. She teased her husband. "We'll be left without a catch." "We won't." Nick grumbled good-naturedly and began to dress quickly. It took them about 40 minutes to get to the lake. All the way they were silent, there was nothing to talk about. While Nick was sorting out the rods and other gear, Anastasia spread a blanket on the grass, laid out the food, and called her husband to breakfast. They ate in silence, listening to the grasshoppers chirping and the bees buzzing nearby. "I'm going fishing," Nick said, rising from the blanket and heading for the lake, while Anastasia put the groceries back in her bag. After standing beside her husband for a while, she walked toward the grove. How good it felt. She spread her arms. What grace. They walked back in silence, listening to music on the radio. "Shall I fry some fish?" Nick asked, satisfied. "I'll clean and fry it myself." "Where would I go?" replied Anastasia, getting out of the car. "We'll boil some more potatoes. We'll have a proper dinner." After dinner, Anastasia sat in her room watching TV. Suddenly she heard a phrase that made her think. Always give people a second chance, but never a third. Could it really be that Nick will change now, Anastasia thought. She walked over to the window. He's been courting me, even giving me flowers. And how can I tell my daughter about the divorce? Now, when she's expecting a baby. It's a shame to part with the apartment. So much work has gone into it. It's a lot of work, Anastasia thought. And what's to hide? I still love Nick, even though of course he doesn't deserve it. But as they say, love is evil, you'll fall in love. She moved away from the window and lay down on the bed. In the morning, entering the kitchen, Anastasia saw her husband standing at the stove, cooking something. "Oh, you're awake?" He was happy, sitting down at the table. "I fried some eggs. True, a little burned. If you want, I'll quickly make new ones." No, Anastasia waved her hands. "It's fine, it's even better." Nick sat down across from her. "How about you and I go to the movies or take a walk in the park? The last time we were there was about 5 or 6 years ago. Do you remember?" Yeah, Anastasia nodded. "You went on all the rides, even though you were hungover that day. And after you got out of the centrifuge, you fell on the grass and lay there for half an hour. I thought you were about to die. I even wanted to call an ambulance." Yeah, I did, Nick grinned. Oh, how much time I missed because of drinking. And how could you put up with me all this time? I was wondering the same thing. Anastasia got up from the table. Why didn't you think of that before? I was a fool. Nick looked at her guiltily. Listen, maybe you'll change your mind about the divorce. How many years have we been together? We'll be grandparents soon. What do we have to share? Old age is around the corner. It's better to face it together than alone. And I'll be lost without you. He sighed heavily. I did not sleep all night today, all thought. I love you, Anastasia. Believe it or not, I can't imagine life without you. Sure, I behaved like an asshole to you, but we had some good times when Rose was born, and I used to get up at night so you'd get some sleep. Remember when we used to redecorate and pick out wallpaper together? Anastasia said. Oddly enough, we liked the same ones. Do you remember when we went to the village for your niece's wedding? And you and I had no place to sleep because there were so many guests, so we climbed into the hayloft? Come on, she said indignantly. You've got something to bring up. I decided to go shopping today, to look at the baby's dowry. Before you know it, he'll be born. So maybe I should come with you, Nick suggested with obvious reluctance. He didn't like shopping. You should fix the faucet in the kitchen. And the shelf in the bathroom is about to fall down, Anastasia said, grabbed her bag and went out into the hallway. I'll do it. Nick fussed. Just hurry back. Anastasia walked down the street, shaking off the bright sun. Young mothers came across her, rolling strollers with sleeping babies in front of them. Soon Rose will be strolling down the alley like that, she smiled. And maybe I'll walk with the baby too, remembering how I used to walk with my daughter. She stopped to admire the little kids playing in the sandbox. They were so funny, they were enthusiastically making sandpits. Roman, it's time to go home. She heard a man's voice nearby. Let's go, or grandmother will scold. Right away, Grandpa. A boy about 4 years old climbed out of the sandbox and headed toward a man standing not far from Anastasia. Grandpa? Grandma, she smiled, listening to the sound of those words. How time flies. It was only recently that we ourselves were running barefoot through the village, swimming in the pond, making plans for the future. And very soon I'll be a grandmother. Maybe Nick's right, we shouldn't get divorced, Anastasia wondered. He really would be lost without me. Nick hasn't been looking well lately. He's in pain, he won't tell me, but he keeps grabbing his right side, and he's been complaining of high blood pressure. I'd never forgive myself if something happened to him. I'll take my statement out of the courtroom tomorrow, Anastasia decided. But I won't tell Nick anything about it. Let him think I'm still determined. Maybe we really can have the human life I once dreamed of. She sighed with relief, as if a heavy weight had been lifted from her shoulders, and strode lightly toward the children's store. And the next day in the evening, Rose and her husband Helium came to visit her mother and father and told them that a girl would be born, whom they decided to name Annie. Time passed, and Nick anxiously awaited the second summons. When he and Anastasia could be divorced for good, he didn't know that his wife had taken out a petition for dissolution of marriage, so there was nothing to fear. Anastasia, I've been thinking, he told his wife. Why don't we go on a vacation? You and I have never been anywhere together. And where will we get the money from? Anastasia looked at him in surprise. It's not cheap. Well, I've put some money aside. He pulled some money out of his pocket. I'll get my vacation money, and if I need it, I'll borrow it from someone. We'll go wild. I found out it's cheaper, and we can find a place to stay on the spot. Do you agree? I don't know, Anastasia said uncertainly. You should think about your health. You've been complaining about stomachaches and nausea lately. When we get back from vacation, I'll go to the doctor, Nick promised. Or maybe I just need a vacation, and then everything will be fine. Shall we go? Let's go, Anastasia waved her hand. We don't know when we'll get away next time. When my granddaughter is born, I won't have time to travel. I'll have to help my parents. That's great, rejoiced Nick. But I have a favor to ask you. He was silent for a while. Let's go on vacation by plane. I realize that it's expensive, but I'm embarrassed to admit. I've never been on an airplane, and I'd really like to try it, Nick said. I've only flown once, the year before last. and I'm afraid to go again." Anastasia looked at her husband with fear. "Do not be afraid of anything," Nick reassured her. "I will hold your hand the whole flight." At the airport, they were a little confused, not knowing which way to go, until they heard the announcer's voice inviting them to check in for their flight at counter number 4. Once seated, Nick immediately fastened his seatbelt and stared out the window, waiting for the plane to start moving. The flight was only supposed to last a couple hours, but Nick was gripped with panic from the first few minutes and his hands began to shake. He gripped the arms of the seat and closed his eyes. Feeling the plane begin to gain altitude, Nick opened one eye. He looked out the porthole and saw that they were flying above the clouds, and now he was overcome with a feeling of elation. The airplane had gained altitude. The passengers became animated, and some even began to unbuckle their seatbelts and get up from their seats to go to the restroom. Nick was still sitting in his seat, looking around curiously. The food arrived, and he was again surprised to find that the airplane had food. After lunch, he began to fall asleep. He closed his eyes and fell asleep. Nick woke up only when a pretty stewardess announced landing. The plane began to descend. Again, there was an amplified noise. Nick grabbed Anastasia's hand, who laughed. Well, who promised to hold whose hand? The plane landed safely and Nick breathed a sigh of relief. It's a good thing we'll be traveling back by train. Nick and Anastasia settled in a private house in a room that barely fit the two of them. Every day they went to the beach, swimming in the warm sea, sunbathing on the hot sand, and in the evening they wandered the streets, listening to the music coming from the sidewalk cafes. Anastasia noticed that despite the vacation, her husband was somehow sad, and one day she asked him about it. "You see, Anastasia," Nick replied, "I've just realized that I've lived most of my life for nothing. I could have seen the whole world with you. But instead, I've prioritized the bottle, forgetting about everything in the world about you. I only cared about my drinking buddies, who were not really my friends at all." It's good that you realize that. Anastasia gently stroked her husband's arm. "You and I have everything ahead of us now. We will work, save money for new trips. And maybe we'll buy a cottage? After all, when the granddaughter is born, she will need fresh air." Yeah, Nick seized on the idea. "I'll build a gazebo, we'll drink tea and talk in the evenings. And we'll put a bathhouse and a swimming pool next to it. I've seen inflatable ones for sale at the store." "Oh, we'll live with you. Just take this divorce papers with you. Or we'll have to remarry again." "Hadn't you noticed that the deadline had passed and no summonses had come?" Anastasia grinned. "I thought you had figured it out a long time ago." "Were you thinking about divorcing me?" Nick jumped up happily from the bench, sighing and clutching his right side. "That's it. When we get home, we'll go straight to the doctor." Anastasia helped her husband back to the bench. "In case you have something serious, and the main thing is to start treatment in time." A couple of days later, they returned from vacation, and Anastasia made an appointment for her husband to see a general practitioner. An elderly man in a white coat listened to Nick attentively and gave him a referral for tests. On his second visit to the therapist, Nick received a referral for an ultrasound of the abdominal cavity and additional biochemical tests. "Doctor, what do you think my husband has?" Anastasia asked with concern. "It's too early to say." The therapist scrutinized Nick's tests. "But I can assume that your husband has cirrhosis, given his previous lifestyle, and the symptoms confirm it." "Now you have to prepare for my funeral," Nick said irritably, when they left the clinic. "Don't be sad for long, you're buried. Get married right away." "Why should you live alone?" Nick said with a bitter grin. Anastasia did not answer anything, understanding the mood of her husband. "Coffin me, choose me, inexpensive. There is nothing to spend, anyway we'll rot in the ground. And don't you dare dress me up in a suit. I can't stand these jackets and ties. Put me in a blue shirt and a gray sweater, my favorite. Then I'll look so handsome for sure." "Stop talking nonsense." Anastasia couldn't take it anymore. "Why are you burying yourself alive? We'll treat it as the doctor says. If necessary, we'll agree to surgery. And you'll be as good as new. And when the time comes, you'll die your own death. But that won't be for a while. Maybe I should go to church, do some penance." Nick suddenly suggested it. God will absolve me of my sins. Maybe I'll get better. How many sins do you have? Anastasia asked wryly. I think I know all your sins. Maybe you're hiding something else from me. I have one big sin, Nick lowered his head. But I can't tell you about it yet. I'll confess it when the time comes. Or maybe I'll take this secret with me to the grave. While they waited for the results of additional tests, Anastasia watched her husband. His appetite was gone, his sleep was disturbed, and he became nervous and irritable. As before, he was angry with his wife and dissatisfied with everything. Maybe I shouldn't have taken the application. Anastasia thought, we would have been divorced by now, and I wouldn't have heard those angry words. When it was time to go to the hospital again, Nick flatly refused. Go on your own, he said sharply to his wife. It was you who forced me to take stupid tests and examinations. I had nothing else to do. I had to go to the clinic alone. Anastasia knocked on the door and cautiously looked into the doctor's office. Ah, Titova recognized. Well, come in, said the doctor. I've come alone, Anastasia crossed the threshold. My husband isn't feeling well. Well, tell me how things are going. The doctor paced the room. Perhaps it's better that you came alone, he said, stopping in front of Anastasia. I have nothing to comfort you. The tests show that your husband has terminal liver cancer that has metastasized to other organs. Is it incurable? Anastasia asked the question and realized the stupidity of it. Couldn't we do surgery or something else? Could chemotherapy be administered? The doctor thought for a moment. You could try. But I don't think it would help anymore. Although, you need to take some more tests to be sure that your body can withstand chemotherapy. Here's a referral to an oncologist for tests. He'll explain everything you need to do next. Anastasia walked home slowly, tears in her eyes and the doctor's voice in her ears, 3 to 6 months. When she returned, she walked into Nick's room and saw him sleeping with his legs tucked under him. Maybe it will still turn out okay, she watched her husband's face. As if he sensed her gaze, he opened his eyes. Seeing his wife, with difficulty he got up and sat down on the sofa. How has he lost weight? Anastasia thought. Only recently we went to a resort. He looked good, even had a little tummy. Now it's so that all his clothes are hanging out. What did your doctor say? Nick asked with a grin. He'll live, Anastasia answered hastily. I just need to take some tests for treatment. We'll go with you tomorrow. I'm not going anywhere, Nick shook his head. I'll live as long as fate gives me. I don't need to poison my body with chemistry. How did he know about the chemo? Does he really know he has cancer? Anastasia was scared. You'll get better if you follow the doctor's recommendations, she insisted. You still have to get treatment. I won't, Nick repeated capriciously. Drink your own pills, maybe it's better for you. Maybe you'll become calmer and they'll let you go. Become as you wish, Anastasia said tiredly. I can't change your mind. The next day, Anastasia went to the oncologist and told him that her husband, Nick, didn't want to take any medication. And she hadn't even told him about the chemotherapy. I'll tell you what the doctor said when asked if Nick had any chance of recovery. A lot in treatment depends on the patient himself, on his willpower and will to live. Sometimes hopelessly ill patients literally cling to life and live for another 10 years, and the other may die of a cold or cut his finger. If your husband does not want to fight, then medicine is powerless here. So just be close to your husband, help him. Support him with painkillers, which I will now prescribe you. That's all you can do to help him. Once again, after leaving the hospital, Anastasia walked slowly down the street and couldn't believe that Nick might be leaving this world very soon. The phone rang and she saw on the display that it was her daughter calling. Mommy, how are you and Daddy doing? She asked cheerfully. Helium and I want to come over and visit you today. Oh, Rose, how can you show up? Anastasia tried to answer. Daddy's a little sick. Don't worry, it's nothing. He got a virus somewhere. I'm afraid I might catch it from him. When he gets better, we'll come to you. You need to take care now. You're about to give birth, so you mustn't get sick. Anastasia said goodbye to her daughter. She walked slowly down the street again. She didn't want to tell Rose that her father was seriously ill. When she had the baby, then she would know everything. In the meantime, let her remain in ignorance. Her husband's temper had changed for the worse again. He became cranky, angry, irritable again. When he was in pain, he would throw a pillow at Anastasia as if she were to blame for his suffering. Anastasia put up with his antics, making liquid porridge and spoon-feeding him. When he stopped rising from the couch, she massaged him to avoid bed sores and changed his underwear. Nick grew weaker every day. He could no longer turn over on his own. His speech became slow and at times slurred. He moaned and gritted his teeth in pain. And in his delirium, he kept saying, "Andrew, take me away, Andrew." 3 days before Nick died, Rose gave birth to a daughter, and Anastasia, sitting beside her husband, through her tears, said, "Well, you've lived to see your granddaughter. Now get well. Annie needs a grandfather. You'll tell her stories and ride her on your back." But Nick didn't understand anything anymore. And just before he died, he looked at Anastasia with clear eyes and slowly said, "God punished me for Andrew. He was killed because of me. I should have been in his place." "What are you saying?" Anastasia screamed. But Nick didn't hear her anymore. After Nick's funeral, Anastasia was afraid to go into the empty apartment, where no one was waiting for her. In the evening, she wandered the streets for long periods of time, pondering her husband's last words, that her brother Andrew had died because of him. Now she would never know how it had really happened. And did she really need to know? After all, it had been so many years. On weekends, Anastasia visited her daughter and son-in-law to babysit Annie's granddaughter. Rose at first reproached her mother for hiding her father's illness from her. But Anastasia managed to convince her that pregnant women do not need negative emotions to bear a healthy child. After the death of her husband, life for Anastasia seemed to stop. Only her granddaughter, who had recently been born, gave her meaning. She blamed herself for once deciding to file for divorce from Nick. Maybe that was the reason for the rapid development of his illness due to mental distress. Although, as the doctor claimed, the development of the tumor began 2 years ago and was mostly asymptomatic. As time passed, the heartache gradually subsided, leaving only memories. Once Anastasia heard a song performed by a famous artist, and the words fell into her soul. "Before, I did not listen to my mother. I lived everything with my own mind. Everything seemed to know better. I stood my ground and, satisfied with myself, quite everything Anastasia thought. I didn't believe that if my sweetheart said something to me, it meant it was all right. But it's true," she reflected. "I didn't listen to my mom once. She said I shouldn't marry Nick. I wouldn't be happy with him. I loved him dearly and thought that thanks to my love he would change and we would live well and long. Alas, that didn't happen. But I am sure that all good things are still ahead of me." The children abandoned their mother in the village and didn't even come to her funeral, and when the notary read the will ... MP4. Samantha was annoyed. There was a session coming up, a lot of tales to catch up on. "I have to pass, I don't have a penny to spare. And then there's this funeral." Mother's neighbor Auntie Annie called and said the funeral's in a day. That's round-trip tickets and probably organizing costs. If John or Stella haven't taken over. I wonder if they already know, but to write to her brother or sister pride wouldn't allow it. Samantha decided not to go, not to spend, not to see the faces of relatives with their sneers and claims. She was studying anyway, so she had nothing to do there. She'll come later and sit on the grave. There was no regret or longing on Samantha's face, rather irritation with a hint of sadness at the shaky way of life. Relationships with her mother. Older brother and sister had been difficult all her life. Her mother molded her into a pretty girl, forbade her to go out and do what she liked. She forced her to learn lessons, help around the house, iron her school uniform from the evening. The forbidden fruit only beckoned more. She slapped her stubborn daughter for her first cigarette, took away her phone when she saw Samantha kissing a boy at the gate. Her brother called her the naughty one from kindergarten. Her sister rolled her eyes and clucked her tongue. Eventually, at the age of 16, Samantha had another fight with her mother over a bow, snapped and left home. She lived with a guy, finished school, then left with him 500 kilometers away to a big city. She worked for a long time, survived the breakup, but saved up for education, and only at the age of 23 she finally entered a university, when she realized the value and necessity of a diploma and education. The girl did not maintain relations with any of her relatives. She had enough friends and colleagues. Rumors, of course, came, what and how, but Samantha did not look for them purposefully. Why? To be told she was a slacker. No, now Samantha was not willing to sacrifice even a fraction of what she had worked hard and longed for. She was studying, working, and in the midst of all that, it was unrealistic to find time for a trip. And she didn't want to be honest. They'll sort it out without me, the girl decided and pushed the outline closer. Stella's mother had failed to mold a decent girl. Unlike her straightforward younger sister, she had a cunning, dodgy character, went by the head and was not afraid to use methods that others seemed dirty. So without much connection in higher education, Stella became the manager of a small travel firm by the age of 28 in the capital. She had a short haircut and generally looked very apathetic, with tattoos all over her arms, bright makeup and expressively pounded face beauticians. The news of her mother's death caught Stella in another country, when she had just checked into a hotel with a girlfriend. The voucher was a 10-day trip. As a calculating and practical lady, Stella calculated how much it would cost for an unplanned return flight and the missing trip, not to mention a ruined holiday. The decision was obvious: to stay and rest. If she wanted to, Stella could make it to her parents' funeral. She was in a good financial position, but principle intervened. "Management is not for women," her mother grumbled. "Our business is to keep the coziness of the house and hearth. Let men earn money. It is their natural destiny. We have a different purpose." "What's the purpose, Mum?" "We are not cogs in the engine. People choose what to be," argued Stella. "It won't do any good if you go against nature." Her mother was unsteady. "You've already gone, you've drawn pictures, and it's time to think about your family." Stella rolled her eyes in her favorite manner and snorted. "Our song is good, start again," it's called. Talking about family, husband and children had caused her gag reflexes since she was in transition. Her mother's old believers pissed her off more than anything else. The inculcation of humility and norms of domostroy ended with the girl doing the opposite. Dress, cut with scissors, dressed in jeans and aggressive rocker outfits. Instead of boiling borscht, Stella chose sketches of future tattoos, and instead of romances for the sake of bouquets and sitting under the moon, she looked for profitable acquaintances. She knew that she wanted to lead, to decide, and to get out of this box of traditional values, where her mother stubbornly shoved her. Of course, by the age of 28, her dream had come true. A chain of useful connections led her to the owner of a travel agency. There Stella promptly got a job, then twisted romance with a man and made it so that he re-registered the business on her. Behind left a broken life of the ex-wife, a pile of fired unwanted female employees, and a pile of gossip. But the ambitious girl did not care. Winners are not judged, as they say. Stella combined management, partying, and constant traveling. Not even cacti could survive at home, let alone husbands, children, and dogs. Self-sufficient, selfish Stella loved unrequited only herself and did not want to sputter on anyone else. That's why she quickly got rid of the suitor, pulling off his business, very clean from a legal point of view. In this succession, Stella went to her mother's house once a year, or even less often. She was sick and bored at her parents' house, with no one to manage her. John himself could make a horde of vocational school students stand at attention when his visits overlapped with Stella's, and Samantha ran away with her boyfriend. That left arguments with his mother, where there was nothing new from year to year. To make matters worse, Megan began to drink and complain about her health. And Stella wanted to get out of her father's house as soon as possible, so as not to cross paths and not to listen to the old woman's complaints. Her brother will sort it out himself. He is a man, and he is the eldest, decided the apathetic head of the travel agency about the news. She should have been there a long time ago. God forgive her, she thought a little later, but didn't say it out loud so her girlfriend wouldn't hear. If Megan was trying to make real women out of her daughters, she was trying to raise a real man in her son. But again, it had turned out to be a mess. John, from a small age, was forced almost everywhere to solve his problems by himself, to stand up for himself and not to roar. If Stella and Samantha were nurtured by their mother with standard feminine instructions, she demanded from her son steadfastness, firmness of character, stubbornness, and determination. In the end, it paid off. John was indeed the leader of the class, the head of the class and the first in his studies. But in the shadow of achievements hid a callous heart despotism, narcissism, indifference to other people's problems. He could make caustic jokes about ugly classmates who secretly counted on his interested gaze. He could bark at his sisters and his mother herself. Samantha spent her childhood hiding from her brother in corners when he came home in a bad mood. John did not understand other people's tears because of a bad grade or worldly injustice. After school, the guy went into the army and decided to become a military man for good. For status and benefits, he married a shy girl from the countryside, made a child, and by the age of 33 moved with his family to the Baltic coast. We could only guess what was going on at home because his wife did not dare to say a word against him. Only a shadow in a dress looked out from behind her husband's back. The fool was clear that he was walking from his wife and generally feels his complete power and impunity. John came home mostly because of some paperwork issues. He knew that his mother began to be friends with the bottle, but limited himself to rare duty calls and money transfers with the words, "Here, go to the doctor." Stella, he thought of her as a boy baby and almost a fallen woman. Samantha was an outright fool and a loser. He always made an example of himself to them, without listening to any arguments. As a result, when all of them were almost separated, communication was reduced first to dry hello in the walls of the house, then to short texts on holidays, and later and completely hushed. And everyone was happy with everything. The neighbor's call came over breakfast. John listened to the news with a stone face. He pondered what to do. The death of a relative is a valid excuse, and it's certainly possible to leave the service. But firstly, it was a long way to go by aeroplane. And secondly, he had long ago had nothing warm ties with his sisters, or with his mother herself. Only actual blood relation. He hadn't been to his homeland in 2 years and didn't care at all. And then there's a funeral. Something akin to longing tugged at John's heart, but quickly faded. "Will you fly?" his wife asked timidly, serving coffee. "No, I'll send money for everything. They'll organize it themselves," said the man. "What about the inheritance?" the wife asked again. John suddenly thought about it. "You're right, but we don't know if Mom left a will. And if not, then we'll get the house for 3 by law. We don't have to break up either, because these things can be solved from a distance nowadays." Aunt Annie was standing by the fresh pit, holding the hand of a young girl. Apart from them, there were about 10 other people at the funeral, neighbors, friends, and former colleagues of the deceased. They never arrived. John, Stella, and Samantha. Aunt Annie wiped her eyes with her handkerchief and adjusted the black mourning bandage on her head. "Oh, it's not Christian for children not to say goodbye to their mother." "We can't make them," sighed the girl, clutching the carnations in her hands. "You're right, Eve, you're right. Megan brought them up, she put her whole soul into it. And the children grew up so ungrateful." Aunt Annie complained. "At least they will come to visit the grave." There were many kind words and tears about the modest wake. But more than one person asked Annie and EVA why none of the deceased's children were present. And they didn't know what to say. After all, they all personally called, or rather Eva knew, but she was too reverent to Megan in life, and too respectful of her memory after her death to explain to each questioner what was the matter. "What are you crying for? Pray tell." Megan looked seriously at her son's red face. The boy was rubbing his eyes with his fist and pointing at the sandpit where another boy, Nick, a young bully, was having fun with his blue brand-new toy truck. "He hit you and you're crying? You have to be a man." Megan reprimanded her son. "Otherwise you'll always be like this. You'll always be a crybaby." John stopped, sobbed, and looked at the offender. "Don't hit him first, but if you get hit, hit him back," Mom instructed him. "And don't give yours back unless he asks for it first and says please." John sat down on the bench and frowned, his 6-year-old brain digesting his mother's words. Olga watched the child but did not hurry to return her son's toy. After a couple of minutes, John got up, walked to the sandbox. "Give back my car, please," he asked the offender. Instead of answering, the bully threw sand at John. At the same moment, the boy jumped on Nick and hit him hard on the back of the head with a plastic spatula. Soon a siren sounded again from the sandbox, but from a different source. A battered John in dirty shorts was proudly carrying the blue lorry home. That day he realized something. That brute force works better than the word please. At the time, his father was still living with them and was also doing his part in raising their first child. He forbade his son to impose female duties and chores on him. He said that a man should study, earn and fight, and his wife would wash pots and iron the laundry for him. As a result, the boy did not know how to make a bed or fry eggs at the age of 9, but he quickly realized his superiority over girls, and with this position entered adulthood. His father was in a car accident and died when John was 13, Stella was 8, and little Samantha had just turned 2. Megan didn't so much grieve as exhale. Alex was a quiet tyrant and demanded total obedience from the entire family. Megan wanted her son to respect women and be strong in spirit, but his father's bad influence had already taken root in the boy's subconscious. The sound of broken dishes in the sink jerked Megan out of her slumber after a night's work as a cook. She heard the noise and scolding from the kitchen. "Clean up your own mess," Stella shouted, pointing her finger at the dirty plate on the table. "That's your job." John shrugged his shoulders and indifferently threw the dishes on the floor. "Stop it," Megan shouted at them both. "Stella, is it hard for you to clean up and help your brother?" "Mum, I'm not the maid to clean up after everyone." The scandalized 10-year-old put her fists to her sides. "He has exams coming up, he's studying, he's tired. What are you, like a little girl?" begged Megan. "I have a test tomorrow, so let Samantha clean up after us," said Stella. Megan stopped and shook her head. She silently picked up a plate from the floor, cleared a second one off the table, cleaned everything up and turned around. John had removed himself from the kitchen with a triumphant look on his face. Stella was breathing noisily, her nostrils flaring wide. "Daughter, you're smarter than that. You should be softer, more flexible." Megan put a hand on her shoulder. "I don't want to." Stella objected. "I don't want to be like you." She stomped her feet and ran to her room, struggling to provide for the children after her husband's death. Megan worked very hard, took more shifts, didn't go on holiday for years, and still had her own business and garden at home. No personal life, no hobbies, no hobbies. Megan lived for her children and the desire to give them the best education, summer camp, clothes, goodies, toys. She would buy something for herself when a previous item wore to holes or ripped. One day a woman was getting ready to go to a parent-teacher conference for her 11th grade son. John looked at his mother's stompy shoes, a stretchy skirt with an old oil stain, a linty blouse, and a late 90s fashion jacket. The guy wrinkled his nose. "Don't go, I'll say you've been working," he stopped the woman who was already making her way out. "Why, son?" Megan looked perplexed at her offspring. "They'll think we're begging," John replied shortly. "Don't embarrass me, Mum." The woman froze on the doorstep. She had barely taken time off work to hear about her son's progress from the teachers' mouths. Megan turned to the narrow mirror on the exit and looked at her own reflection. In front of her stood a tired, unkempt lady with bags under her eyes. John took her mother by the elbow. "I'm not a big boy, they won't scold me for sure, but you already know that." Megan went back to her room and tears came to her eyes, then sleep watched the exhausted woman. When John left for the army, Stella was 14 years old. Megan had hoped her daughters would be her helpers, but the exact opposite had happened. Transition age at Stella began to manifest itself early, but very clearly. It was immediately clear that the father's genes left their imprint here. The girl was hysterical on any occasion, closed the door and crooked her face at any attempts of her mother to impute to her some morals. But among her girlfriends and friends, Stella enjoyed authority and had unquestionable power, and she could expel or punish her unwanted comrades with her own hands. "You can't do that," daughter Megan sighed, as she listened to Stella's boastful stories. "You'll make enemies." She said, "You can't, but I can." "Are you going to torture your husband like that? He'll run away in a week." The woman shook her head. "Who said that I would have one at all?" Stella folded her arms across her chest. "What do you mean?" Megan shook her hands. "What about a family? Sooner or later you'll want warmth, coziness, babies." "Ugh, disgusting." Stella grinned. "I've seen enough of you. Thank you, don't. There are much more interesting things in life than cleaning a man and feeding a baby." The conversation was over. Megan had asked herself many times, why did the children grow up the opposite way, not the way she raised them? Instead of love, understanding and respect, selfishness and narcissism gurgled in each. John remained in the contract service and enrolled as a part-time student in college to qualify for an officer's rank in the future. He hardly ever called, and when he picked up the phone, he waved off the fact that he had no time to talk. By the end of high school, Stella was more concerned with her own appearance than with grades and exam preparation. She worked part-time at various places to get tattoos and fashionable haircuts. Megan didn't know about the first for a long time. The latter she accepted with a stretch, calming herself with the fact that hair, not teeth, will grow, and the pictures on her daughter's body she saw when it was too late. A piece of work popped out from under the sleeve of her t-shirt. "What?" asked Stella snidely, watching her mother stare at her arm in horror. "Do you want to see the whole thing?" The girl took off part of the t-shirt. A grinning dragon in mottled colors and bright spots looked up at Megan. Why, tell me?" The woman frustratedly sat down on a stool. "I wanted it so badly." Stella shrugged her shoulders. "Do you like it?" "It's not right." Megan mumbled. "It's a lifelong stigma for a girl. You'll be seen as a you-know-who. A decent guy doesn't need a coloring book." "Mum," Stella shouted, "I've argued it 1,000,000 times and I'll argue it 10,000,000,000,000 times. When you were a kid, you only got tattoos when you were a convict and a girl of easy virtue. In your youth, you had to study, get married, and have a baby. In your worldview, girls wear dresses and boys wear trousers. I'm so sick of your lectures." She threw the dirty rag she was wiping the table with at the wall and ran off to her room. In the evening, Stella ostentatiously dumped her shredded skirts and dresses on the carpet in front of her mother. "You can't make me wear this now, no matter how much you want to. I've seen these traditional feminine values in the oven." Megan didn't argue anymore. Her daughter was wearing her down with her behavior, drinking her dry like a glass of water. She only hastily wiped away a tear when she saw the blue dress she'd bought for her daughter's graduation in a pile of rags. Once in a while, Megan was visited by her neighbor Aunt Annie, a vivacious grandmother who had also raised 2 children on her own, tilled the vegetable garden every season, and kept poultry. Stella treated Aunt Annie with indulgence. She could treat her aunt to jam, but she didn't interrogate or teach her. Samantha often played with her neighbor's grandchildren and took her well too. "You're looking a little gaunt, Megan. It's time you quit this kitchen," Aunt Annie said, stirring her tea with a spoon in her mug. "Well, what's there to quit?" Megan waved me off. "What are the helpers for?" "There are 2 growing up." Annie nodded at the framed pictures of the girls on the wall. Megan twirled the mug in her hands and gazed at the floating tea flakes. "Annie, I don't think my kids love me," she exhaled. "What am I doing wrong?" "Oh, come on." Aunt Annie waved her hands. "All children love their parents, and so do yours. You do so much for them." "That's what I'm saying." Megan nodded. Annie took a candy from the vase and rustled the wrapper. "A child's individuality should be embraced. His view of the world to encourage, to guide, just a little support," she mumbled. "So how to accept, if they break their life, their future life?" Megan thumped her fist on the table, spilling her tea. "But it's their life, and you can't protect them from all their mistakes." Aunt Annie calmed her down, helping her to wipe up the puddle on the oilcloth. "The world is changing, and they are changing. You're teaching them to accept. What about you?" Megan suddenly froze. Her neighbor's words poked her in the soul, but she couldn't admit it. The woman was trying to be a caring mother from a position she'd seen in her childhood and thought was right. "I have 2 boys. Annie sat back down, so what do you think? They drank and smoked when they were young. They went out and got Fs. But now they're both handsome, both family men. They bring their grandchildren to me on weekends. Real men have grown up. The neighbor clapped her palm on the tablecloth. I scolded them, of course, in a good way, but I left the right for mistakes and bumps. The woman continued, if you insulted your friends, you got a slap on the neck from them. If you tried vodka, let it get so bad that it would kill you. That's how it's brought up. Only on their own skin they understand. I can't do that, Megan shook her head. Her neighbor took her hand in a conciliatory manner. Megan, even if you can't, the main thing is that you love them and want the best for them. They'll grow up, they'll understand later. For now, let them be sarcastic. Don't take it personally. Be above the childish antics. They need to prove themselves. Spread their peacock tails, let them. Megan remembered her daughter's tattoo, her son's capriciousness and coldness, and could not understand how she could react calmly to such an attitude from people close to her, although that was exactly what the kind-hearted neighbor had insisted on. A paradox, no other way. Stella ran away to the capital with some maid at the age of 18, having drunk a lot of her mother's blood. She didn't want to go to school, but she did some management and executive courses. Megan had many conversations with her daughter about the need for a normal education, but everything was like a pea against the wall. Stella was of a different opinion and stubbornly continued to tear down the standardized female image. Samantha was growing up too, and at first Megan thought she was a sweet and docile child. She wasn't soulless and narcissistic like her brother. She wasn't selfish and dodgy like her sister. She helped around the house, even though she grudgingly cooked and cleaned. But since she was 14 years old, Samantha's mind was exclusively on partying and boys. She often skipped school, ran on dates, hanging around with one suitor and another. Teachers called Megan with interrogations and requests to influence her daughter to no avail. One day, Samantha endured her mother's admonitions for a long time, and then she gave out. I'm young, I want to have fun. I don't want to grow moldy over books. Megan was appalled by this statement. If John and Stella at least had goals and desires, even if they didn't quite fit the gold standard, Samantha was close to going down a crooked path. And so it happened. One day Megan found her daughter's packet of cigarettes in a secret jacket pocket. So she burst into her room and yanked Samantha right out from under the covers, sleepy. You're smoking. Megan yelled at her. I don't need an ashtray in my house. She grabbed the strap from her bag off the chair and slapped it across her defensive daughter's back. Megan had never hit a child, except for a little spanking when she was a kid, but here it was as if she'd snapped. It was as if in that blow she had unleashed all her anger for the three of them on one. Afterwards, Megan repeatedly blamed herself for the outburst, and her son's words, "Samantha is a naughty skirt," came to mind. Then Samantha did not speak to her for 4 days. She didn't stop smoking, but she hid it better, out of spite. She also stopped doing things around the house, also out of spite. She had a tomboy, an 11th grader, and the kind of handsome guy that drives girls under 20 crazy. Samantha was no exception and went head over heels in love. Christian's schooling was lousy, but he secretly drove her around in his dad's car at night. He taught her how to pour beer without foam, and always told her about some shady dealings with the boys. Samantha was impressed and dreamed of running away with her lover to the end of the world. So in the evening, her mother caught them kissing under the cherry tree at home when she returned from work. Megan knew Christian and his family well, rarely earning a living anywhere. Father a lover of the collar, mother a gossip. Samantha was elbowed right out of her beau's arms. "Mum, why do you always get on my nerves?" she said. "You should be studying, not cuddling in corners with this guy," Megan said angrily. "I'll take care of it myself. You haven't lived your life, let others live theirs. Will you sort it out if you become a whoremonger?" Megan felt her voice breaking into a croak and her face burning with anger and helplessness. How could anyone accept such a thing? How could anyone knowingly accept the desecration of their own child's life? Megan didn't understand. Samantha wanted to say something, but froze. The scandal ended when Megan didn't find her daughter's things at home the next evening. She called her, texted her, asked her to come back, begged her to come to her senses. But Samantha said briefly that now she lives on her own and does not need her mother, who considers her a walking wench. So the woman was left alone in the big house. And the other will say, live happily ever after. The offspring are off her back, but not Megan. No matter how the kids treated her. And coming to empty rooms was harder. She called both John and Stella. But they didn't like to talk long, saying they were busy. They came rarely and not for long. Aunt Annie came in frequently and did something to brighten the loneliness of her mother. Megan even got a cat to keep her from being bored, but she could only listen and meow back. Soon the long hours on her feet and the age of 55 made themselves felt. At the examination, the woman was informed about a whole bunch of problems: varicose veins, cardiovascular disease, joints. Gradually, Megan herself did not notice how she began to befriend the bottle to brighten the loneliness and drown out sad thoughts. Aunt Annie walked into Megan's house and found the landlady asleep in the kitchen at the table. The woman roused her. Lately, Aunt Annie had been very concerned about her neighbor's condition. She had become unsociable, crying all the time, and even the house had become neglected. Annie tried to visit more often, but she couldn't stay with Megan. She was in her 70s. "Megan, come on up. It's morning," she shook her yawning and mumbling landlady. She jumped up, looking round and then shamefully hiding the wine bottle behind the table. "You've had enough of living on your own," Annie said as Megan cleaned herself up and began to prepare breakfast. "Who needs me? Men look at young men, and I'm old." Annie smiled, though she meant something else. "Men, it's a matter of time," said the neighbor, "and I think that you need an assistant and company." "My helpers are gone," Megan sighed, setting down her cocoa. "You're just rushing off the beaten path again." Aunt Annie scolded the woman. "I have an idea how to help you, so you can have more fun without this happening." She kicked an empty bottle under the table. One of Annie's sons often supplied orphanages with goods and other help from concerned compatriots. Orphans on reaching adulthood were supposed to be given flats under a state program, but in practice some waited years for them, and some didn't get them at all, but they had to live somewhere. "There's a girl there, EVA, she was pretty. But she didn't get a flat and had a baby when she was 19. Now she's scrounging around. You know how hard it is to earn money for rented accommodation with children. I feel sorry for the girl." "I don't know where you're going with this, neighbor." Megan listened intently. "I'm saying that you should take her in and help her with the household, and it won't be boring. And you'll do a good deed. You won't work forever. You'll be cooking soup and borscht in this canteen. And I'd get Ivotchka a nanny at the kindergarten through my old connections," Annie finished. Megan frowned. She didn't like the prospect of letting a stranger with a baby into her house. But then again, Annie was right. She was already going crazy with loneliness. It couldn't get any worse. "Could you vouch for her?" Megan asked her neighbor. "If I didn't vouch for her, I wouldn't even be having this conversation," Aunt Annie nodded. "I've known Ivotchka for a long time. I even wanted to adopt her. But where would I go as an old woman?" Didn't they approve? "So let her help you and live with you," Megan said. Annie looked into her eyes carefully, warmly and understandingly. "Megan, I'd take it, but you need it more." "I can see that." Stella looked irritably at the mud on her new shoes. The mud of her hometown, where she'd fallen into when she'd got out of the taxi. "Home, sweet home," she muttered through gritted teeth. Stella wasn't going to be here long, and the next day she already had a plane to the capital, so she stayed in a hotel. She was preparing herself morally for the meeting with her relatives, her older brother and younger sister. After all, for the first time in many years, they all had to gather together in the notary's office for the announcement of her mother's closed will. The news of it came as a great surprise. Stella had assumed that the house would go to the three of them in equal shares according to the law of inheritance, but not so. The girl was tormented by a bad feeling. The call with the news again took her by surprise when she returned from holiday. Now there was no way to get out of it. Who knows what the shifting on correctness maman scribbled in the will, and the very fact of its existence was a surprise in the midst of troubles. There was nothing to do. I had to board the aircraft again. Not to leave all her mother's possessions to her relatives, to a crazy soldier and a naughty skirt. Stella even thought over in her head how she could competently take away their parts of inheritance from her brother and sister. She even called the lawyers she knew, who were frequent visitors in her travel agency, but they only shrugged their shoulders, saying that a closed will is a cat in a bag, and therefore some schemes can be proposed only after its announcement. The notary's office was not far from the center, and near the entrance, Stella noticed a familiar figure with an army uniform. She snorted quietly and prepared to greet her brother. "Hi, you're still the same," she said as she approached him. "Hi, I can't say the same for you." John glared at his sister. He didn't like her haircut, or the tattoos that peeked through her translucent blouse on both arms, or the lemon-colored stiletto heels and red trousers. Stella appreciated the look and rolled her eyes, but quickly regained her neutral expression. They exchanged short phrases about life, weather, and nature, and waited for the last participant of the meeting. Surprisingly, there was almost no longing or sadness in the words of these people, only a poorly disguised irritation at the need to disrupt the usual way of life. No one even thought of going to the cemetery to say goodbye to the deceased. "She's a slacker in her repertoire," John grinned. Lighting another cigarette, she was told to be here by 12, so it's early morning, and she's not here. "She's probably wondering where she woke up today," Stella chimed in. Probably mocking her younger sister was the only thing she and John had in common. Soon a taxi pulled up outside the office. A disheveled Samantha jumped out in a hurry. Her hair was tucked into a ponytail, her crumpled t-shirt straightened out of her jeans. "I think you were right," John whispered in Stella's ear, glaring scornfully at his relative. "You're late," Stella said without greeting or ceremony to her younger sister's face. "I know," Samantha snapped back. "It's not my fault the bus took so long." Stella rolled her eyes again and pushed her fringes aside. "You'll make it up to me later," John said sarcastically as he pulled open the door. "We have more important things to do right now." The notary, who looked like a business canary, put everyone in their chairs. "First of all, I'm sorry for your loss. Losing your mother is a great blow. If I may, without further ado. We're busy people. We don't have much time." The notary nodded ceremoniously and asked for the testator's death certificate. John pulled the document out of his briefcase and handed it to him. The man ran his eyes over the papers, checked something, made a short note, and finally pulled an envelope from a desk drawer. He showed his signature and date on it. Mom must have felt it. She had drawn up a document 6 months before she went to the other world, Stella whispered, not addressing anyone in particular. Why did she have the nerve to write that will in the first place? John replied irritably. Maybe someone put the idea in her head, Samantha suggested, and instantly caught the frowns of her relatives. Both of them didn't like the idea, because the consequences could be bleak. The second envelope was also properly signed by 2 witnesses and the notary himself. In one of the curlicued signatures, Stella recognized the hand of her neighbor Aunt Annie. The envelope was opened, and at last the required paper lay on the notary's desk. The deceased's will was written on an ordinary yellowed sheet of paper from an old notebook, which did not fit in with the official office and the situation. While the notary read out the text, Stella nervously tapped her fingernails on the phone screen. Samantha was stirring a candy wrapper in her hands. John was crunching his knuckles. Everyone realized the importance of the moment and waited. I bequeath all my movable and immovable property. The notary raised his eyes at the audience, made an expressive pause to EVA Smith. There was such silence that one could hear a fly crawling on one of the folders on the far shelf. I take it there is no Citizen Smith here. The notary looked at the young people with equal surprise. What? Stella jumped up first from her chair. Who the hell is Smith? What the hell is Smith? What the hell is going on here? She rushed to the table, wanting to see for herself if she had heard a mistake or a joke. But her mother's handwriting said exactly what she'd heard. None of the names of the 3 children Megan had put in the will, and the complex signature at the bottom with its many curlicues testified to the genuineness of what she had written. Stella remembered from high school trying to copy it in her diary and failing miserably every time. We won't leave it like that. We'll contest it. We'll sue that Smith, whoever she is. Yeah, sue all you want. The notary shrugged his shoulders indifferently. My business is done. Oh, and don't forget the copies. Under the puzzled, lost, and somewhere angry looks of those present, he made 3 copies of the will, certified them, and handed them to everyone in turn. I'll get that Smith from under the ground, thundered Stella on the doorstep of the office, not at all embarrassed by passers-by. This is the house, and my father's garage, and the land where he wanted to build a summer house. Samantha was twiddling her thumbs in horror. Her mum gave it all to her. John spat in the flower bed. I wish I knew what it was for. It's all right, it's all right. We'll sue, we'll get every last plank in the house. Stella's eyebrows rose angrily, her eyes blazing with rage. We will. Only you. Don't expect us to share too much. John slowed her down. What do you mean? Stella drilled him with a glare. I've got a son growing up. He needs a place to live too. John emphasized the word son. And I need to invest in my business. You'll earn a house for your son too. Stella bit him back. Hey, I don't actually have a flat. I live in a rented one. Samantha shouted, listening to her brother and sister bickering. Both of them stared at her with such eyes that it became clear that they were ready to get rid of the third applicant for the inheritance right here. Samantha squeezed her head cowardly into her shoulders. The bickering under the door of the notary's office continued. Everyone realized that a quick resolution of the case would drag on for an incomprehensible period of time and incur costs and nerves. Meet Eva, and this is her son, Oliver. Annie introduced Megan to the girl standing modestly on the doorstep. She had a 1-year-old baby in her arms and a small check bag. She was poorly dressed, but she had a thick, shoulder-length blonde braid and huge blue eyes that still held a certain childlike naivety and belief in miracles. Megan remembered how children had looked at her with those same eyes, a long, long time ago. Ivochka, you come in, make yourself comfortable. Megan will show you everything. Annie pushed the hesitant girl into the room. When the guest had left, the neighbor asked her, Megan, why don't you look like you belong here? Good girl, did I ever cheat you? She's good, Annie. She's good, Megan said. But I'm not used to her. You know, I need to look at her more closely. Megan looked at her for a couple of weeks. At first, the conversations between the new acquaintances were awkward and clumsy. Aunt Annie, as promised, got the girl a job in a kindergarten, where she was happy to go to work. This way she could look after her baby and earn a little money. In the house, Eva did not do much housekeeping, only asked short questions about cleaning and other household trifles. The baby didn't interfere with anything, and was quite quiet. The awkwardness was gone, thanks to His Majesty Chance. Megan, I'm back, Eve said loudly as she opened the door. The landlady's shoes were in their place, but she herself could not be heard. The girl cautiously entered the room, placed the cradle with her son on the armchair, and found Megan napping. There were a couple of empty wine bottles on the floor next to the sofa. But Eve rushed over to the woman and began to bring her to her senses. Megan opened her eyes and looked around awkwardly. She had promised herself every day for the past 6 months that she wouldn't buy any more wine, that she wouldn't lock herself in her room and drink until the pinching feeling of emptiness was filled. But when she returned from her shift, her feet carried her to the shop, and her gut demanded relaxation. Megan guessed that Annie had insisted that Eve move in because she knew about her neighbor's addiction and was worried. Also, everyone realized that Megan's children didn't care about her. They were busy with their own lives and would at most put their mother in rehab for a while. Megan, what are you doing? EVA looked worriedly into the woman's eyes. Your blood pressure, your heart isn't right, and you're drinking. Megan staggered back. The girl shamed her, but justifiably so. And then the unexpected happened. The accumulated tension, longing, sadness overflowed the cup and tears spilled out. Megan buried herself in Eva's chest and burst into tears. The girl fell into a stupor for a few seconds, and then embraced the woman and began to affectionately stroke her back and comfort her as if she were a small child. "I always dreamed of having a big family," said the lady of the house, while Eva was pouring tea. "I wanted to be a mum. I played mother's daughter all my childhood, read fairy tales about princesses." Oliver sat in the pram, staring at Eva and Megan. He listened too, occasionally crooning and banging his fist on the side of the stroller. Mum didn't allow her to go out with boys. She taught her to be meek, docile, soft. She told me to take care of myself for my husband. And I looked at them and my father and thought that I would have the same, a warm family atmosphere and respect. A hot dinner in the evenings at a big table. Our table was small though, and our flat was only 2 rooms. Megan sniffed her nose like a schoolgirl. Eve put the cups on the table and sat down on a stool next to her, watching her son, who was starting to fall asleep. I always thought that my husband was a support, a wall, the main and wise one. That's how I lived until I met Alex. I fell madly in love, but I didn't see who. I got pregnant with John. We got married. And then Alex moved us here, to this house, and I realized I was in a fairy tale. The woman grinned and sipped from her mug. Not the fairy tale I'd read, though. I thought I was a princess, but it turned out to be Cinderella. You'd know how much I crawled here on my knees pregnant, scrubbing the floors, washing all the windows and mirrors every day. I cooked 3 dishes with a belly first, second, and compote. Eva listened without interrupting. My husband worked, received well, we had enough, but he demanded perfect cleanliness and housekeeping, and I happily plowed like a horse on the domestic barns. I loved him a lot. Caught rare moments of tenderness from him after reproaches for dirty table or unpalatable cutlets. I thought it was my own fault. I didn't work hard enough. I didn't look. Then my son was born and I went into motherhood, began to raise my own joy. Only bad things stick easier and faster. We all know, and instead of a good son grew a copy of her husband, who thought that a woman should only. Oh, his poor wife now, poor girl. How guilty I feel for her. Megan sniffled again and hastily pulled a napkin from the napkin holder. "It's not your fault," Eve intervened gently. "You did everything you could to make the child happy. Bad example and bad upbringing played a part. I wanted to raise my son to be a noble, kind and fair man like his grandfather," Megan explained with a sigh. "It's a shame he spent so little time with his grandson and left early. If only it had been different, if only it had been. My love, care, and involvement were taken for granted by my husband and later by my son. I realized this many, many years later. I didn't see my mistakes then and made the same mistakes with my daughters." Oliver dozed ludicrously in the pram, arms outstretched. Megan stood up to cover the baby with the blanket. Eva didn't bother her. When I got pregnant with Stella, my husband demanded I contribute to the family budget. So I ran headlong into a job. We're a family. But mentally, he ate me up every single day. And then I found out he was cheating. I cried to my mom, looking for support. She said that everyone has such patience. The main thing is children. He'll take a walk and come back. That's how I learned that my own father wasn't such a noble man. Just my mother was wise and did everything to make me see the perfect picture. It was already getting dark outside the window. A fine October rain began to pour down the panes. The neighbors 2 houses away had a rooster crowing loudly for some reason. Eva drew the curtains and carefully carried Oliver, who had fallen asleep, into his room to put him to bed, promising that she would be back soon. When the new neighbor tiptoed carefully into the kitchen, Megan was already making tea for the 2nd time. "And I did a new stupid thing," the landlady continued. "I forgave him, just like my mother said. Why? I was young, naive, only 26 years old. My husband realized that he had complete power over me and could go unpunished in any situation. He nagged for every speck, for crumpled laundry, for the mess of children. And I obediently tolerated and only scolded myself, that bad mistress, bad mother, bad as a woman. And then the 3rd pregnancy, I decided to leave, hoping for miracles once again. But no. In bringing up the girls, my husband was stricter, scolded for any disobedience, even the very tiny Samantha, and for some reason I gave in. I clogged their heads with marriage, correctness, wisdom, femininity. Oh, if only I'd realized sooner, if only I'd realized. Megan made eyes at the ceiling and often stopping the tears that had returned on her lashes. And when her husband crashed with his mistress, as I found out later, It was as if the rope around my neck had loosened. I wondered myself that I should be sad and crying, but I wasn't. Even though I had to work harder, I was glad, but for now only that no one else would come to my bed from under someone else's skirt. Quiet humiliation went away and my eyes began to clear, but I still lived indoctrinated by my mother. A woman needs a family, a loving husband, her own corner. I tried to instill that in my daughters. I got so far that now they both see me as an enemy, and my son as a second-class man. Eve moved closer and lightly hugged Megan, whose shoulders were shaking. I wanted so much to raise sweet, affectionate girls, but with my impositions I've raised an egoist and a walker. Do you know, Avochka, what is the saddest thing in this story? She looked up at the girl. I realized my mistakes only when they all left. And I'm old and alone and none of them need me. Megan, don't be so nervous. Eve's calm strokes on her back were soothing. All people make mistakes, but there are no mistakes that can't be corrected. You did what you knew how to do. You loved and cared for them as best you could and knew how. I'm sure it's worth talking to everyone and everything can still be saved. Oh, my dear, do you think I didn't try when the realization hit me? Megan sighed. I called. I wrote. I invited them to visit. They waved me off, said they were busy. The only thing I got was a couple of meetings with my grandson and money for medicine and doctors. I decided to go to them myself, but they stopped me. I tolerated, tried to understand, to justify them, but I knew I was deceiving myself. I was burned by this feeling of helplessness before those whom I myself created. And I broke down. Yes, I started to drink. It's the only way I can dull for a little while the pain of not being needed by my children. All your life you have given yourself and your joy to those around you, husband, children, strangers. Were you ever really happy? Eva asked cautiously. I don't remember. I was happy for my son's grades, for my husband's success, for the fact that the children ate well and did not get sick. That's not it, Eva said, although as a mother I understand you. I'm happy when Oliver eats and sleeps well. But that's different. When you were happy for yourself, were you genuinely happy inside? This time Megan was silent for a long time, trying to search her memory for such a long-forgotten feeling, and found it only in childhood, when her mother brought her a small kitten from work. Megan had played with it for a long time, cherishing it and stroking it. I think I'd long since forgotten what it felt like, she said quietly. A lot of people forget, but it is very important to keep the ability to be happy at any age. Eva smiled. Let's learn again. Come on, and please just call me Megan. The woman smiled weakly in return as well. Thank you. Surely the neighbor knows who this EVA is, Stella reasoned as she sat in the taxi, once again cursing at the lack of asphalt in the dirt of her hometown. When the fervor for swearing at the notary's office wore off, the trio decided to go to Annie's. She had called with the sad news she was also a frequent visitor to her mother's house, and her signature was on the envelope with the will. Stella, Samantha, and John agreed that she was the person to ask first. There wasn't much time. Everyone had their own things to do in town. They wanted to solve the difficulties that had arisen quickly, but it was not to be. Not only the situation became tense, but also periodic jokes and sarcastic clues to each other added fuel to the fire. They found the neighbor at home. Stella did not hesitate to bang her fist on the wicket door. Aunt Annie came out. Hello, hello. She greeted the unexpected guests with a youthful strut. And I've been waiting, wondering when will you shameless people show up? Aunt Annie, let's not get moralizing. Stella wrinkled her nose and tried to go through the gate. Aunt Annie put aside her bun, blocking the girl's way. You have no conscience at all for not coming to your mother's funeral. And as soon as you opened the will, you came running. The neighbor continued to reprimand the sibling standing by the fence. That's the law. John couldn't take it anymore and raised his voice. Why are you shouting? The granny told him. You've grown so big you've put on epaulettes, but you've never become a man. John opened his mouth in amazement. They remembered the neighbor as God's dandelion, who never said a rude word, brought them sweets and sweets. Let's put down what you think of us. Answer one question for us, and we'll never see each other again, Stella said in a tone that muffled the conflict. Suddenly a girl peeped out of the kitchen window of the house, which overlooked the wicket. Aunt Annie, what's all the shouting? Is everything all right? Yes, Yavochka, go put Oliver down. I'll be right there, the neighbor replied. Yavochka? Stella's eyebrows went up. Just a minute. But it was too late. Aunt Annie slammed the wicket door shut with an unprecedented swiftness for an old woman. There was the suppressed shriek of Samantha, who had her fingers nailed, followed immediately by John's profanity. The company realized that no one else would talk to them here. The swinish attitude towards their mother had played its part. Stella and John took some documents and things from the once empty house, and then all three of them left for their respective cities. This is for you, Eve smiled radiantly and handed Megan a candy floss stick. For me, the woman was so confused that she looked at the treat with fear and confusion. It was Indian summer, a Saturday. Both of them had the day off. A small circus was performing in the local park. EVA, on the pretext of going out with Oliver, had dragged Megan out to walk there. Come on, come on. She jokingly hurried Megan on her doorstep. On the last warm days of October, it's a crime to stay indoors. The woman hesitated at first, but then agreed. Megan caught herself thinking that it had been a long time since she'd taken a walk like this. All her routes were calibrated for a specific purpose: work, home, shop, hospital. She had somehow forgotten that you could just wander aimlessly for fun, chatting with someone and not constantly looking at your watch. The park was already beginning to put on its autumn finery. Crimson maples were dropping a carpet of patterned leaves on the pavement. Birch trees were swaying their soft branches, where, like a scattering of coins, the foliage was golden. In the flower beds, late velvets and dahlias bloomed with furry pompons. The sun glistened on their petals with beads of night rain, and only the fir trees were unperturbed green spots in the orange red of October. Megan even admired the landscape, breathing in the still warm but already damp autumn air. She remembered long-forgotten sensations: calmness, joy, silent, quiet delight, when vanity seemed to be wiped away like dirt from glass. Did you enjoy the performance? Evie asked. Yes, I haven't been to the circus in probably 20 years, Megan admitted. I never thought I could go there just for fun, without a reason or my kids. A lot of things are fun to do for no reason, EVA said, fixing Oliver's cap, who said you needed a reason to be happy. Megan looked at her with either respect or sudden insight. You know, EVA, you're not at all what I used to think you were, she admitted. The girl laughed. Who did you expect? A new with a moping temper? Well, not exactly. Megan faltered awkwardly. The question had stumped her. EVA wiped Oliver's applesauce-smeared hands, put him back in the pram, and said, I came to the orphanage as an adult, at the age of 12, and I already knew what it was to starve, what it was to hide from a drunken father in the cellar. That's why I learned to appreciate joyful moments, and in the orphanage I realized that if you let your guard down and cry all the time, you can go crazy. Now Megan listened eagerly to her companion. It was amazing how Eve's appearance didn't match her strong core inside. It was carefully hidden from view, though. And then I thought, why do we only rejoice on holidays? I mean, why do we do that? Gifts, surprises. Why are we trapped in this stereotype? I started to break it as best I could. First, I made paper cranes for all the children in the orphanage, and then I figured out how to sew beautiful outfits from the things that were donated to us. We even organized a fashion show once. Megan laughed. She was surprised at how much will, fortitude, and courage to appear different was in this fragile girl. I loved what I was doing, and I saw that joyful moments are very much needed all around, from small to great. My students reached out to me, and of course someone fell in love with me, EVA sighed. It was a spontaneous feeling, an impulse inspired by my idea, a joy in the midst of grayness. But now I have this little Kolobo. She patted Oliver's head affectionately. But all is never well. She glanced meaningfully at Megan, and when I turned 18, I found myself with a baby outside the orphanage. They wanted to leave him there, but I wouldn't let them. I couldn't get a flat, and I rented a room in a communal flat on my cleaning lady's salary and child allowance. That's how I realized to the fullest extent how important it is to be happy that you just live, and perhaps help others to live. Is that why you went to work with the kids? Megan suddenly guessed. Yes, Eva nodded. Children still know how to enjoy the little things. With adults, everything is drowned in routine, in some stereotypes and invented frameworks. We drive ourselves into a cage where there is nothing but vanity, problems, and fears. There are very few people who in adulthood can genuinely rejoice and see the beautiful things around them. She pushed back her braid and pointed to a woodpecker on the trunk of one of the maples. Megan also noticed the bird with the red beret hopping busily on the bark. You've welcomed me into your home, and you've been kind, and I'm eager to help you enjoy life again, Eve said. And you're starting to get good at it. Megan hugged the girl, hiding her wet eyes from her. It had been a month since that conversation in the kitchen that evening. Megan had forgotten the last time she'd had a drink, and her house felt cozy and bright again, in a way it probably never had been before. Maybe it was because both women needed that coziness, and both tried to keep it. Evenings were spent talking over fragrant tea or taking walks. Eve told Megan about everything. The woman was amazed at how broad the girl's horizons were and how much she had missed in her life. One day the group wandered into the evening park again, and some guy gave both of them a rose. Megan was so embarrassed she didn't know where to put the flower. She finally wanted to come home in the evenings, to cook something delicious, to hang out with Oliver and listen to EVA. It was amazing how close to her this girl, a stranger by blood, had become. Aunt Annie sometimes came to visit and watched Megan come to life more and more, the blush returning to her cheeks and the sense of purpose in her eyes. It was as if Megan had gained a daughter and a grandchild during this time, and there was no talk of rightness or marriage. How easy it was to accept someone with their particular views, cockroaches, and experiences. And even if EVA cooked soup differently, cut bread thickly, and scrubbed floors the old-fashioned way, Megan no longer wanted to argue, to correct, to teach. And it was not indifferent humility, but the very acceptance she had always imposed on her daughters, imposing what she herself didn't understand. One day at lunchtime, two men in overalls knocked on the gate of Megan's house. The landlady stepped out, looking behind the wicket in surprise. Eva was putting Oliver down for his afternoon nap. "Hello, we're from the utility company. We're checking for wiring past the meters." The men introduced themselves and shoved a form under Megan's nose, which she didn't have time to look at. "We're legal," she said, confused. "If it's legal, we'll check for frayed wires. What if you have a leaky roof? The danger of fire due to a short circuit is not a big deal." One of the guests raised a finger and put his foot very firmly into the courtyard. "All right," the woman stepped aside, allowing the worker to pass. The repairmen began to examine the wires and their location, then with serious faces looked at the pole, scratched their heads, wrinkled their brows, and as a result they said, "You have one wire here that is not connected to the meter, and the coating on it is frayed. We should cut it off and see if there's any sign of a short circuit in the house." "I don't think it's shorted out. The TV's working. The light bulbs are intact." Megan shrugged. "You can tell the firemen the same thing later," one of the men said indifferently. The woman had no choice but to let the workers into the house, and they began to do a lot of work there. They started climbing along the sockets, picking at the lamps, looking into the switchboard, examining how the wires were laid, without even taking off their muddy boots. Megan just sighed with a palm resting on her cheek in the corridor. 10 minutes later, one of the workers came up to her again and said with a mournful face, "Mistress, there was a leak in the ceiling near the switchboard and sockets without grounding. You need to repair, or Chirocronet's 220V from the kettle or iron in the rain and all." He even made scary eyes for convincing. "So how is it? How many years have I lived and everything is calm?" Megan only splashed her hands. "You live for so many years and tomorrow it will happen," continued to frighten her interlocutor. Suddenly his partner came out of the corridor, followed by EVA with a telephone in one hand and a heavy glass decanter in the other. "We don't need to change anything," she said sternly, shaking the schedule. "We didn't call anyone." "What are you doing, girl?" "We've come to fix the malfunctions," waved his hands at a man in blue overalls. "Troubleshooting that you just invented yourself. Get out or I'm calling the police." EVA showed the dialed number 02 on the screen. The men cautiously put their heads into their shoulders and glanced round. Megan was dumbfounded, but her hand instinctively picked up the heavy Soviet kernel on the table. which she had recently used to pour soup for lunch. Megan, these, shall we say, electricians came in with no tools, no ID, and a piece of paper from the internet. Call them and have them picked up. After saying that, the men rushed out of the house, almost knocking down the doors. All Megan could hear from the backyard through the window. I thought you said it was a woman living alone, you dear. When her pounding heart calmed down and her breathing became steady again, Megan was already sitting at the table, waiting for Eve to put some valerian in her glass. How did you realize that those crooks weren't from the utility company? She asked the girl. I saw and heard from the window how you let them in, and I noticed at once that they came without tools. Electricians don't just walk around like that, and they won't come at all if you don't call them. Eva was watching the drops on the neck of the vial, and then one of them dropped the paper they were shoving in your face, and that's when it all became clear. She set the glass down in front of Megan and pulled a crumpled piece of paper out of her pocket. It was a crooked scan of a 3-year-old installation permit. Oh, the woman sighed. What would I have done without you? Obviously, you would have been left with no savings, Eve answered bluntly, but everything turned out fine. But let's change the locks on the gate and the door. You never know. The women became almost kin to each other. Evia had made friends with the younger members of the kindergarten staff. She sometimes asked Megan to babysit her son while she made time to go to the hairdressers or do some shopping. It was a joy for Megan to babysit Oliver. She even thought of him as her grandson. How different were those happy moments from the few hours she was allowed to spend with her blood grandson. John and his wife were constantly criticizing her for everything and literally ripping the baby out of her arms. It was different with Oliver. He was happy to collect colored pyramids of rings with Megan, throwing cubes and balls, learning to walk, supported by a caring woman. EVA would sometimes come and watch from the corner of the house, watching Megan's care for her son. Everyone understood, and everyone needed it one evening. The girl walked into the kitchen to take the baby from the lady of the house and noticed a slight sadness on her face. "What's wrong, Megan?" Eve asked worriedly. "Oh, EVA, my heart aches for my own children." Megan sighed. "I wish we could communicate with them like we do with you. About everything in the world, at least on the phone. They haven't called or written in 6 months. Samantha ignores me completely." Eve thought about it. "I think you can try to improve your relationship with your children, but you need patience. I've put up with an arrogant husband all my life. I'm sure I'll have enough patience." Megan gave the girl a serious look. To pick up the phone and write to the children, these thoughts caused in the woman a stupor and fear of a new refusal to contact her loved ones. So strangely, she both wanted and feared it. Fear vividly resurrected memories of her youth, of caprices and torments with the hard characters of her offspring. And then Megan pushed the heavy thoughts out with an effort and began to remember the autumn walk in the park and after the circus show. She imagined walking like that with Stella or Samantha. Finally, having tuned in enough, Megan dialed her eldest daughter's phone. "Hello," Stella's voice came through after a series of long beeps. "Hello, Stella." Megan exhaled, gathering her strength. "How are you doing?" "I'm fine. Why are you calling?" Her daughter's voice became suspicious. "Do you want money for the doctor or something?" "No, daughter, I just want to talk to you." The woman swallowed. "Well, you talk. I'm listening," agreed on the other end of the phone. Something rustled in the phone. A knowledgeable person would have immediately realized that the call had been put on speakerphone. "Stella, you and I have never understood each other," Megan began. "It's probably my fault. I forced things on you that I was unhappy with without realizing it. Please forgive me, but now I realize my mistake and I want to know how you live and breathe. I want us to be able to talk like girlfriends and not hold grudges. Is that okay with you?" There were clicks, distant mutterings, rustling. "Why are you talking to your girlfriends?" Stella's voice came from somewhere, as if from far away. Did Aunt Annie come? Or what? Then it became clear that the girl is settling some work issues on another phone. "Yeah, we're chatting." Megan's lips quivered. "Bye, daughter." She pressed the cancel button and cried, covering her face. Eve rushed to comfort the poor woman, but she sobbed like a wounded animal. "Oh, I'm an old fool for hoping for a miracle," Megan scolded herself through her sobs. "Who needs me with my morals?" "I do, let's try again." Megan looked at her dejectedly, smearing her tears. "A little later, right?" Eve corrected herself, nodding cautiously. The frustration and sadness left Megan alone only towards evening. She realized that one attempt wasn't enough, that more would be needed, and already the first one had stabbed at her soul. It was even scary to call John. He was the most callous and cold-blooded of the three. The woman didn't even know what words to choose for such an important conversation with her son. Only Eve's closeness, her support, sincerity, and participation gave Megan strength and determination. John picked up the phone immediately, unlike Stella. His clear, service-chiseled hello rang through the house, even from the tiny speaker. "Hi, son." Megan began. "I wanted to." "Mum." "Hurry up," John interrupted her irritably. "I've got things to do." "What's up?" "Nothing. Nothing." The woman lowered her eyes sadly. "I'll leave you to it." "Yeah, go ahead," came from the other end. "We'll try again later, we can't give up." Eva comfortingly took Megan's palm in her hands. The woman was no longer crying after the second call, but her eyes were filled with resignation. "Ivachka, I don't think it's any use. They're adults, and they've been used to ignoring me for so long that it's too late to re-educate them." "And your youngest, Samantha? Is she a little older than me?" Eve wondered. "I don't know her contacts," Megan said. Embarrassed for some reason, she blocked me everywhere after the fight. "All I know is that she lives in the city and is studying, I think." "Well, there had to be some kind of communication channel, right?" Eve wouldn't stop. Suddenly, Megan jumped up and hurried into the room, muttering something. She rummaged through the dresser for a long time, then pulled out a dusty diary. Among the recipe entries on proper cotton washing and phone numbers, the woman found her daughter's email address. She used to use this address at school back in the day. Megan pointed to the corner of the page. "I can't believe I didn't remember before." "It's better than nothing," Evie said. "We'll think of something to write tonight. In the meantime, why don't we go get some ice cream?" "Ice cream in December?" Megan smiled. "Why not?" Eve winked at her. "Who says we can't? You'll be in a better mood in no time. Just what the doctor ordered on a gloomy day like this." She went into the freezer for a batch of ice cream. Megan watched with a cheek resting against her cheek. She realized that Eva was trying her best to keep her spirits up, but her motherly heart would still ache. Even though Eva had become like her own daughter, she couldn't undo the mistakes of the past on her own. It's amazing how sometimes common troubles pull together and try on even sworn enemies. After returning to their respective towns, Stella, Samantha, and John started a general chat room where they discussed the issues with contesting the will. It took a couple of weeks to figure out Eve's identity and get the outside story. Albeit with a creak, the company agreed to split the inheritance exactly 3 ways. Nevertheless, Stella pestered the lawyer with questions about how to legally get the most of it. The poor boy already regretted that he had tangled with her, and mentally cursed all the gods who once invented the court and inheritance. "This is Evka, an orphan with a litter," Stella broadcasted in the voice message. "Allegedly took care of her mother for the last year, but there are no documents to prove it. So she and her offspring are screwed." "It's interesting," John answered. "Some left-handed girl with a child lived there for a year, and her mother described everything to her." "What kind of a ride of unprecedented generosity is that? Can I live like that and in a year or 2 I'll have a flat?" Samantha finished. Stella clicked her pen irritably. She was pissed off by the situation. The world of calm, measuredness, stable income, parties and holidays shook because of this idiotic will. Now, thanks to the efforts of her mum, she had to make a fuss, spend money and time. "Yes, relatives know how to put a pig under the door," she said under her nose even after death. The prospect of sharing was not pleasant either. Talking to her brother and sister was annoying. John covered himself with the baby, Samantha with the lack of a place to live. The first was pushing his way through, the second was whining like an itchy mosquito. Stella caught herself thinking that she wouldn't mind doing her brother and sister a favor if they were busy solving urgent problems here and now instead of gnawing out their inheritance. Eva and Oliver had gone to daycare, and Megan had just returned from her night cook shift. For weeks now, the woman had been plagued by a vague premonition. She'd been thinking, deciding, calculating things in her mind, weighing things, but she'd never told Eva. The woman took a nap for a few hours, thought it over once more, and went to her neighbor's house. "Annie, I want to write a will," she blurted out, sitting down in front of her. "God be with you, Megan." Aunt Annie waved her hands in the air. "Are you going to die?" "I have a premonition. I don't know. I just have a feeling I should do it now." When Aunt Annie stopped oohing and ahhing about her neighbor's statement, she clarified. "It took me a long time to get round to it, but I think I'm doing the right thing." "Well then, it's necessary to call a notary if you're going to do it," Annie thought. "Yes, we can't do it without a notary," Megan confirmed. The women called the notary's office and made an appointment. The notary informed them that they would need 2 witnesses. "Don't tell Eva, please," Megan asked her neighbor before leaving. "I thought we were going to use Eva as a second lookout." She shook her hands. Megan shook her head. "No, we can't have her." Annie thought for a moment. "I've got a son coming over in those days. Maybe him?" Megan agreed, nodded, said goodbye to her neighbor, and went home with a slightly relieved heart. The day before, she had spent a long time composing something else, an email to her youngest daughter. She wrote a bunch of pages, scribbled, wrote again, scribbled. Then with difficulty, she created a mailbox with Eve's help and slowly retyped the text onto the screen. It had been a week since she'd sent it, but her inbox was just as sad and empty. Evie had said that sooner or later her daughter would respond with something, a single word. Megan tried to believe. She generally tried to notice more good things around her. It had become an acute daily necessity on the way to getting rid of the enormous guilt and resentment she felt toward herself, her children, and life. And at times Megan felt she was succeeding. In the flight of a swift, in the glint of a puddle in the sun, in the warmth of a mug of fragrant tea passed from hand to hand, she gathered the grains of her medicine. And close by was the one who always supported and protected the fragility of the recovering soul. Stella enlisted all her connections and hired the best lawyer available to challenge her mother's will as soon as possible. It took several months, but the girl got her way. In court confirmed that as direct heirs of the first turn of the native children of the deceased, the 3 of them, Stella, John, and Samantha, have legal rights to receive all the property of the mother. However, the second part of the plan could not be realized. The inheritance was awarded equally to each of them. Nothing. Stella rubbed her hands together as she left the courtroom. "We'll use our own methods here. The main thing is that the sneaky orphan was left with nothing." The bossy head of the travel agency was accustomed to do so when legal methods were exhausted. A couple of conversations hit the right pain points, scare her, gather dirt. Who cares how she gets what she wants? John and Samantha didn't attend the trial. The first referred to the service, the second on the cost of traveling. Stella alone represented the interests of the 3, though the interest here was rather entirely hers. The relatives were notified of the entry into the inheritance by registered letters from the lawyer. The girl thought over ways of action, how to force the fools, brother and sister, to sell the mother's property as soon as possible, so as to hide from them part of the income from the transaction. Stella's plans were Napoleonic. She had long yearned to open a second branch of the agency, to exchange her 1-bedroom for a 2-bedroom closer to the center, and what to say, to run away to the States. Neither a fair division of money, nor the welfare of relatives, Stella did not care what was to say about a strange girl with a strange child. Neither EVA nor Aunt Annie attended the trial. The old woman and the young mother had no opportunity to go to the capital, although they knew what was happening. EVA was taken aback when she learned that Megan had left her all her possessions. The girl was very confused. She experienced 2 shocks in a month, first from Megan's death, then from her will. The woman passed away in her sleep, having had a heart attack. Eva found the one on her bed when she got home from work. It was 2 months after the will was written. Megan had a feeling, and she wasn't wrong, unfortunately. Where the hell is that damned abstract? Samantha muttered irritably to herself as she picked at the bowels of her laptop. The previous day she had been given a study assignment, and she remembered that at school she had prepared a big report on a similar topic. Samantha decided to find it, print it out, and hand it in again, so that she wouldn't waste time collecting and processing the material again. Stella had contested the will, and now the three of them were the rightful owners of the house, land, and garage. Samantha was tempted to look for a cozy flat in the suburbs. She was already dreaming about moving in, what kind of renovation she would do, what kind of sofa she would buy. All the furthest school folders of the laptop were dug through and through and through. Nothing could be found through the system search either. Samantha was already nervous, imagining a sleepless night preparing an essay. But her memory told her that she had sent the paper to the teacher's post office in the 10th grade. She had to remember the password to the mailbox she hadn't used for a long time. After much manipulation, Samantha managed to log into the account. She began scrolling through her inbox with interest. Mostly there were advertising offers, emails from some dreary scammers, and archival photos of her classmates. Stop. What is this? Suddenly Samantha saw a letter from an unfamiliar address. It was strikingly different from everything else that had accumulated in her email box over the years. It wasn't that old. It had been sent just under 8 months ago. My eyes ran along the lines indifferently at first, but with each word I read, interest, anxiety, embarrassment, realization, and shame grew like a snowball. Hello, my daughter. How are you? I don't know whether you will read my letter or not, but still I hope for the former. I want to ask your forgiveness for everything from beginning to end. For the upbringing you disagreed with. For my desire to mold you into a copy of myself and condemn you to the same torment. For my inattention to your inner world. And for the gulf that separated us that evening at the courtyard, turning into years of silence and coldness. I hope you'll forgive me. I didn't realize my mistakes until many years later. But I don't blame any of you three. You grew up to be who you grew up to be, and I'm still secretly proud of you all. But we've made so many mistakes. Resentments, misunderstandings, harshness, rudeness have divided us all as if we were strangers. How many of your happy moments I missed and didn't see? For which I now blame myself terribly. I wouldn't have dared to write to you, my daughter, if I hadn't had help. I met a girl who opened my eyes and showed me what I had been depriving myself of all the years of your childhood. I finally have the strength to admit it. I realize I'm asking the impossible, but let's try to become just a little closer as family people. I hope with all my heart for a speedy reply. Your mum, Megan. Samantha finished reading the letter, lips jumping, shoulders shaking. She threw herself onto the back of a chair and burst into tears. Those pure and sincere words from her mother burned all the years of resentment out of Samantha's soul. That night the girl did not sleep. She forgot about the essay, about her studies, about the fact that she had to go to classes the next day. Samantha sat on the floor of the room against the wall until morning, hugging a small plush toy she had brought from home many years ago. It had been given to her by her mum for the 1st of September. The toy had been gathering dust under the couch in a bag for years, but today Samantha found it, blew the trash away, cleaned it, and coddled it like a kitten. At dawn, the plush was wet with tears, her eyes swollen, her face flushed. As soon as the clock struck 8, Samantha realized it was time, or rather, she could already. She frantically flipped through the phone book, looking for Aunt Annie's number. When she found it, she called the older woman, apologized repeatedly, and struggled to get Evie's number. Her fingers trembled. Samantha exhaled, hastily wiped a tear from her cheek with the palm of her hand and dialed the numbers. Hello, Eva. You don't know me, but we need to talk. My name is Samantha. I'm Megan's youngest daughter, and I want to give you my share of the inheritance. Seeing a rich woman throwing away a baby pram, a beggar decided to take it for herself. And as soon as she opened P4. Sandra scrutinized the woman's face on the laptop screen. It so happened that the search engine had accidentally given her an article about this Tiffany, the founder of a charity fund to help children in difficult situations, left without parents or brought up in very poor families. A mature, well-groomed woman, kind look, open smile, stylish, so energetic. Sandra couldn't take her eyes off her face. She gazed, remembering was she or wasn't she? It looked like she was. She couldn't be sure. After all, Sandra had seen her only once in her life almost 15 years ago. And yet some inner feeling told her that this was the woman who had once played such a big role in the fate of their family. What would have happened to them all if it hadn't been for Tiffany? Or was it not her after all? Sandra ran her eyes over the article once again. It talked about Tiffany's life. She was quite happy now as she had finally found her true calling. The woman helps children and considers it her life's work. Tiffany had even taken in 3 babies from an orphanage, the kind that everyone else had given up on. They had health and behavioral problems, but now they were well-adjusted teenagers, 2 girls and a boy. They posed for pictures with their foster mother, beautiful, dressed up, smiling. And just 10 years ago, no one would have given them a chance. Tiffany proved by her own example that the impossible is possible. The main thing is love, faith in children, and willingness to work long and hard. Not everyone can do that, of course. Tiffany is rich. Her husband is a big businessman, the owner of a famous chain of petrol stations. And she's achieved a lot herself. For many years, she worked as a stockbroker and managed to make a fortune. In an interview, Tiffany admitted that she used to consider her career as the main thing in her life, and money was not even the main motivator. No, Tiffany grew up in a fairly wealthy family and has never known want. Sandra read this article on the internet like a fascinating book, holding her breath. It seemed that Tiffany was the guardian angel and savior of their family. Everything fit together with amazing accuracy. It was just that the work fascinated her, enthralled her, completely inspired her. It was kind of like an interesting game that a woman would give herself over to. And then everything changed. Tiffany was in her early 40s at the time. She started thinking about having kids. And that's when it became clear that it wasn't that simple. Sandra pulled away from the screen, leaned back in her chair, and sighed heavily. The memories came back to her in slow waves. Heavy memories of the past. She had been on the verge of despair then. Sandra couldn't cope with the hardships that had been thrust upon her. Nothing good seemed to lie ahead of her. The hopeless misery of survival. Sandra, then very young and inexperienced, did not want to wake up in the morning because what good could another day bring her? A terrible state of mind. She had never experienced anything like it before or since. Sandra's life hadn't been spoiled at all. She was born into a very poor family. Her mom worked as a cleaner, her dad worked odd jobs wherever he could. Both of them were uneducated. They finished 9 grades and didn't go on to further studies. Then somehow they met and started living together. As far as Sandra knew, her parents weren't even married. The 3 of them lived in an old wooden building on the outskirts of town in a former barrack. The family had a small flat there, or rather, they rented it with their own corner. Sandra's father and mother never got their own place. They were both quite happy with that life. If one of the spouses managed to earn more money, there was a party with drinking, cheerful neighbors, dancing, talking until morning, and sometimes fights. On such days, Sandra bought cheap sweets from the nearest shop, stale gingerbread, chocolates with nuts, soda in tin cans. The little girl felt almost happy. But the truth is, fear always came afterwards. The drunken guests of her parents, many of them instilled fear in Sandra. Sometimes she even did not sleep at night, listening to the sounds in the kitchen. Until now, the girl thought that everyone lived the same way she did. Sandra did not go to kindergarten. From the age of 3, she was left alone at home while her parents worked or went for a walk somewhere. But she even liked it. She could play wherever she wanted and make as much noise as she wanted. No one reprimanded her or calmed her down. Sandra had many friends in the yard. The girl knew them from birth. They were the children of the very neighbors with whom her parents were so closely associated. These boys and girls grew up just like Sandra herself. It was a rough neighborhood. That's how everyone lived. And then it was time to go to school. And it was there that Sandra realized how different her own life was from that of many other children. Her classmates had beautiful new bags and clean clothes. They brought beautiful toys to school, discussed computer games and trips to the sea. Sandra felt like she was in another world. At first, the children tried to stay away from the unkempt Sandra. The girl wore an old dress with worn orange shoulders, inherited from one of the neighbors. The little girl was very out of place, and Sandra herself was in no hurry to get close to her classmates, who were like aliens to her. But Sandra looked closely at these girls and boys. She understood a lot about this life by looking at them, and tried hard to fit in with this alien, but so attractive world. Sandra learned to keep her things in her workplace in order. Around her small desk there could be chaos, empty bottles, some rags, rubbish, but the desk itself was perfectly clean. The girl began to ask her parents for new things, albeit cheap, but from the shop, not from someone else's shoulder. Sometimes she even managed to persuade her parents to buy, and Sandra also tried very hard to study hard. True, with this was trouble. The girl honestly crammed all the rules in the textbook and memorized the formulas, but still made mistakes in words and examples. And physics and chemistry remained for her an incomprehensible science. Sandra was frustrated, but she didn't give up. She studied diligently and studied hard. Teachers saw it and praised her for her diligence. Even overestimated hard-working Sandra, encouraged as they could. But Sandra realized that she would not make a scientist, and so would like to become an economist or lawyer, to work in the office, to walk in a beautiful blouse and a narrow skirt, and be sure to wear high-heeled shoes. But the girl was very mature for her years and realistically looked at things. She knew that she would not reach university, but she would definitely get a specialized secondary education. Teachers helped the diligent student, drew her a good certificate. Thanks to this, Sandra entered college as a pastry chef. The profession seemed to her suitable, in demand, useful. "You'll never go hungry," her mother approved of her daughter's choice. Her father was gone by that time. He had died a year earlier from poor quality alcohol. Mother, by the way, also briefly survived the spouse. When Sandra was studying in the second year, her mother, drunk, fell asleep in the cold and froze to death. Sandra that night was preparing for exams because it was a winter session and did not suspect anything. She thought that her mother, as always, would stay the night where she was walking, but she decided to return home. So very young Sandra, who was barely 18 years old, was left alone. It was good to be an adult, or she would have had to go to an orphanage. Sandra suffered the death of her parents, no matter how they were, but still loved her, and in their own way took care of her daughter, never beat, never humiliated. And the fact that sometimes they were indifferent, so they themselves had such a childhood. No one had taught them how to bring up children properly. But the girl did not have to worry long. Life itself did not give. She now had to think about how to provide for herself. No, Sandra had been working a little bit by little for a long time. She cleaned the floors instead of her mother or her shift worker, or substituted for a saleswoman in a local shop for a few hours. But now Sandra needed a lot more money because she had to pay rent, take the bus to college every day, and eat. So Sandra got a job as an assistant in the school canteen. The job was hard in every sense. She had to carry heavy pots and pans from place to place all day long. After the shift, Sandra felt as exhausted as a lemon. And what was there to study for? Of course, the girl could not combine work and college. She was soon expelled. Sandra cried then from despair, injustice and impossibility to change anything. Wow, she tried so hard to make it in the people, and in the end repeats the fate of her parents, also left without education. But Sandra will definitely not drink. And she will have a family of her own, with a caring, hard-working husband who will take care of her. Maybe she will have time to finish her studies. Who knows how life will turn out? Sandra dreamed of having a family. She was tired of living alone. She wanted to have a reliable man to rely on. But the local boys were not suitable for a life partner. They were firmly following in their parents' footsteps, and it was obvious. Looking at the peers with whom she grew up, Sandra wondered, do not they realize that they need to somehow get away from such a fate, at least try to fix something? But they didn't seem to see anything special in their way of life. Everything suited them. They felt quite happy, got together, had children and split up, had fun parties with fights and long conversations about nothing. Just like their parents. Sandra had been invited once, but she'd always refused. "Why are you ruining my reputation, you smart ass? You've got a bad temper, looking down on everyone," Cynthia, a neighborhood girl and once Sandra's closest friend, complained. Cynthia didn't work. Why should she? She already had a young son for whom she received a good amount of child support. I wish she had child support from the father. But the trouble was, he didn't work. Cynthia often invited Sandra to visit. The girl refused. She knew exactly what went on behind the flat doors, the same thing that had once happened in her own home. Partying, meaningless conversations, and fights. Sometimes Sandra wondered, I wonder why I turned out so different. Perhaps it would have been easier for her if she had turned out like everyone else. But no, Sandra longed for something different. She realized that she needed to move somewhere else first, otherwise she would never get out of this quagmire. But she was desperately short of money. And then Sandra met Scott by chance. The girl was returning from another shift, tired, could hardly move her legs. She sat down to rest on a bench, bought an ice cream. She spent the whole day in the canteen, where they had a terrible heat. I wanted to cool down at least a little. It was the middle of May, and the weather was quite summer-like. It was quiet, calm, and beautiful in the park. Dressed-up people were walking along the paths. Pleasant music was coming from the speakers. I didn't want to go home to my barracks. There again, there were parties behind the wall, poverty and hopelessness all around. Those people in the park probably don't realize that there is another world out there. They think it's just as beautiful and clean everywhere else. Happy. Why are you sad? There was a voice. A young man sat down on the bench. He was pleasant, with an open smile, kind dark eyes, charming dimples on his cheeks, and slightly disheveled brown hair. I was walking in the park, not touching anyone, and then suddenly such an amazing phenomenon, a beautiful girl on a bench, alone, very beautiful and very sad. It's not right. Sandra smiled. A cute guy called her beautiful. Great. That even gave her goosebumps running down her back. Not at all like the greasy compliments of Sandra's neighbors. But what kind of beauty is she? She's just ordinary. Just ordinary. What's he doing here? Jason the stranger introduced himself. May I ask your name? I don't mean to be insolent or intrusive. Just so I can address you in some way. You don't mind, do you? Sandra. The girl smiled, a little embarrassed. She wondered what would happen next. Jason wasn't repulsive, he wasn't tense. On the contrary, he had a way about him. His smile was warm, kind, sincere. They sat on that bench for a long time, talking about everything, telling each other about themselves, and gradually growing closer, becoming almost kin. Jason, too, had been left without parents. He had been raised by his aunt, his maternal sister. He didn't know his father, and his mother had died when he was barely 5 years old. A very young woman was let down by a sick heart. So little Jason ended up in his aunt's family. She was not too happy about the extra mouth in the house, but did not put out. However, she could not surround her nephew with love and care. Jason understood this fact, and was grateful to his aunt for not sending him to an orphanage. It's better than growing up among strangers, he reasoned, but it's family, I guess. Sandra shook her head. Jason might be right, but his aunt was still too indifferent and aloof. Sandra's mother and father certainly loved her in their own way and cared for her daughter as best they could. Jason, it turns out, knew no parental affection or love at all. After completing 9th grade, Jason enrolled in technical school and began studying to be a welder, but never finished his training because he needed to work. Feeding an 18-year-old forehead wasn't something his aunt was going to do. I have raised you to adulthood. I have fulfilled my duty, decided this strict woman on the birthday of my nephew. Now be kind to start your own life, to move out. It's time for you to move out. So the guy had to hurriedly finish the driver's course and get a job at the base of the factory. Sandra even gasped when she heard that. How similar to her own story. She couldn't finish her studies either. That's why she had to support herself. She was just a little bit away from graduation, but she had to get a job. I'm grateful to my aunt for doing that, Jason smiled. But I'm only 20 now, and I'm a fully independent person. My peers are still on their parents' backs, and I'm my own boss. Jason rented a flat in a good neighborhood, and he managed to find a good job. He drove for the head of a big factory. The pay was pretty good. It was enough to live on, and even have some fun. Jason and Sandra had never been apart since that memorable evening. First they met, went on dates. The guy was always coming up with something new. They walked around the old city center, looking at unusual buildings, or sat in cafes. They would go to cafes, places the girl didn't even know existed, or something else. After only a month, Jason suggested that Sandra move in with him. She gladly accepted. Why, it's even more profitable to rent one flat instead of two. Besides, she had wanted to leave her barracks for a long time. Jason was kind, caring, sensitive. He was exactly the kind of man Sandra had always dreamed of having around. He could do everything: cook, make repairs, and handle money. Handy, responsible, economical. Most importantly, he loved Sandra very much. The girl felt it. Of course, she loved Jason too. And the young people felt really happy then. There were so many good things ahead of them. It seemed to both of them that they would succeed together. It was no coincidence that fate had brought together two people with such similar stories and the same outlook on life. Jason worked as a driver. Sandra continued to work in the school canteen. Now she would come home, happily buy something tasty on the way to make dinner for her lover, and wait for him to come home from work. They married a month after they started living together. That's how quickly things developed for them. They didn't have a big wedding. What's the point? No extra money. There were no relatives who would need all this festive action. It was better to buy something for the house. We celebrated together in a restaurant. We had a lovely time. Jason looked at Sandra with serious eyes and said he would do anything for their family. We'd be happy, we'd have children, and they'd be happy for us. I'd do anything, Sandra recalled. And Jason did try to keep that promise. He worked hard. He was given bonuses, which he put aside for future housing. The couple had a shared dream of getting their own flat, and they were on their way to it. Both, of course, realized that the fulfillment of this desire is still far away. But nothing, not all at once, slowly. Jason and Sandra decided not to rush into having children. Both thought that first they needed to earn their own corner. The couple wanted their baby to have a happy, carefree childhood. Not like theirs. But fate, as it seems, has a plan for everything. One day Sandra realized she was expecting a baby. She had a sort of epiphany one morning. It was too early to suspect anything, but Sandra was suddenly struck by the thought that a baby was already living and developing inside her. At first, Sandra waved away these conjectures. Then she took a test 2 stripes. There could be no doubt. Well, the mother-to-be was hardly surprised. She could feel everything. At that time, Sandra had no idea that at the same time a complete stranger to her, who would soon play a huge role in the life of their young family, was also rejoicing at the positive test. Jason was happy to hear the news, picked up the young wife Sandra in his arms and spun her around the room. The father-to-be hugged his beloved so tightly that it was even difficult for her to breathe. "Wow. I was afraid to tell you. I thought you would be upset," smiled Sandra, looking at the shining husband. "Why is that?" He was surprised. "Well, we wanted our own flat first to get on our feet, and then. We planned everything completely differently, but for some reason I'm incredibly happy." "This is the best news I've ever heard in my entire life," Jason agreed. Sandra smiled. Jason is so good. She was just now getting used to having someone like that around. The best, the nicest man on the whole planet. And he loves her. What a blessing it is. The young couple began to prepare for the arrival of an heir. Sandra was transferred to a lighter job. She was no longer allowed to carry pans and her salary was reduced. But Jason started taking part-time jobs. During the day he drove his boss around, and in the evenings he used a lorry to deliver materials to the sites. He did what he could to raise more money for the baby's birth. "Our baby should have everything we need and more," Jason said as he hugged Sandra after work. She felt sorry for her husband, seeing how tired he was. But what could she do? He was right. They had no one to help them. They had to do everything on their own. And it's not easy. Then came the long-awaited maternity leave. Sandra felt not very well and was glad to be able to at least a little rest before the appearance of her beloved daughter. The ultrasound had already shown that it would be a girl. The couple have even decided on a name. Jason said he wanted to name his daughter Emily. Sandra didn't mind. She liked the name too warm, so sweet. It was a late September evening. There was no sign of trouble. Jason had gone to his part-time job moving furniture from one town to another. He was glad to be able to bring an extra penny into the house, which of course was not really extra at all. The weather was good, the motorway was quiet. Jason was an experienced driver, despite his young age. Sandra was often anxious when her husband made long-distance journeys. But that evening she was not anxious at all. Sandra was lying on the couch with her laptop and picking out things for the baby girl to wear for her discharge. Yes, it's still a couple of months away. But while the parcel will be delivered, a lot of time will pass, she thought with a smile, looking at the tiny overalls and halters. Of course, the dresses were especially adorable. It turns out that even luxurious evening dresses are made for newborns. It was so nice to imagine my little girl in these clothes. I wonder who little Emily will look like. We won't know until 2 months from now. Jason and I are both cute. Emily's going to be a beauty either way. But that's not even the point, as long as she's healthy, Sandra thought. And then the phone rang. Sandra immediately felt something. She didn't feel like picking up the phone. A call in the evening, and from an unfamiliar number, not good. But there was no way out. Sandra Lucas' voice sounded excited. She recognized him immediately. It was Jason's partner, his colleague. It was Jason's partner, his colleague. Jason has crashed, the man's tone was worried. How? Sandra exhaled. She felt a sudden twinge in her stomach. He lost control on the motorway and went into a ditch. They took him to the regional hospital. Is he alive at least? I don't know anything. It was a terrible accident. I happened to be passing by, saw a familiar lorry, and then it happened right in front of me. Go to the regional hospital or call and find out. They took him there. I had time to ask the doctors. Sandra, having hastily changed her clothes, ran out of the house. The blood pounded in her temples, her legs shook, her heart clenched with an icy hand from anxiety. Just so long as I'm alive, just so long as I'm alive, she whispered without noticing it. Without thinking of safety, she stopped a hitchhiker. There was a guy behind the wheel. He looked anxiously at the pregnant young woman with terror-crazed eyes. Do you need help? He asked sympathetically. Is it time to go to the maternity hospital? No, to the regional hospital, Sandra asked. Will you bring me? Yes, of course. The young man did not ask unnecessary questions, and he did not take any money for the journey either. It was obvious that the guy sympathized and empathized with the passenger, but he didn't want to pry into her soul. However, he asked her a couple of times if she needed help. Sandra said no. How could this young man help her? The young man drove her to the gate of the regional hospital, wished her good luck and left, and Sandra rushed to the registrar's office to find out, finally, where her husband was and what happened to him. For a long time, she had to run between the buildings of a large regional hospital. No one knew anything. She was redirected from one department to another. Sandra was exhausted until she finally found the information she needed. Jason Brown, he's being operated on right now, the receptionist said, checking the notes in a thick notebook. He came in a few hours ago in a serious condition. Sandra exhaled with relief. Being in a serious condition. But he's alive. So the doctors got him to the hospital in time. It's in the hands of the surgeons now. What about him? What kind of injuries? She asked. And what are you, in fact, his wife? Yes, Sandra answered and mentally reproached herself for not having thought to bring her passport. But she had run out of the house in such a state that she had no time for that. Luckily, no documents were needed. The receptionist took her word for it. Wait for the operation to be completed. The surgeon will contact you afterwards. Just leave your phone number. Can I wait here? What's the point? The surgery could go on for hours. It's late. Go home. In your condition, you need to rest. There's nothing you can do for your husband here anyway. And yet Sandra stayed at the hospital until the end of the operation. She sat on the couch at the door of the surgical ward, praying to herself. She'd never done it before and didn't even think she knew how. Now the words themselves were popping up from somewhere in her subconscious. Leshka must survive. He just has to. How will she be without him, Sandra thought. The girl from the reception came up to her several times, brought her water, biscuits. At first she seemed so strict, so indifferent, but then she showed herself a sensitive and attentive person. She looked at Sandra with regret and said encouraging words. Even gave her a hug or two. This support made it a little easier. The operation took a long time. It ended in the morning. Sandra could not sleep a wink. How can you sleep when your heart is clenched with fear for the person you love? Finally, a tired surgeon came out into the corridor. Sandra, dying of fear, carefully looked at his face, trying to understand what news he was going to tell her. "The injuries are serious," said the surgeon. "We had to fight for the life of your husband. Pulled him, you might say, from the other side of the world. Now everything depends on the organism will cope or not. In any case, a few days will be critical. If he survives, he will have a long and difficult recovery." Sandra nodded her head. At that moment, she was not thinking about the difficulties ahead. The most important thing was that Jason survived. The surgeon was giving details of his injuries. His situation was very difficult indeed. What was he doing here? The doctor sighed sadly at the end of his monologue. He was so strong, handsome, strong. Now at best he will become an invalid, and that is if he survives. Oh, young people, you don't think with your heads. Sandra sighed. You can't explain to this man in a nutshell that Jason worked hard for their child, working multiple shifts, grabbing any part-time job he could get. He's got himself in a bind. Jason lost his guard on the motorway because he was tired. That's why he went into that ditch. Sandra stepped out onto the hospital porch after dawn. She hailed a taxi. At least she hadn't left her phone at home, although she could have in her condition. Then the phone vibrated again. Who would be calling this early? The man Jason worked for last night. "I know what happened," he said. "I understand your husband is in the hospital now?" "He's alive, I'm told. That's good." "But you understand me too," said the man on the other end of the line. "My lorry is beyond repair. The furniture is broken too. According to the contract, your husband is fully financially responsible, so please reimburse me for this damage. Even if not at once, even in installments, but..." Yes, of course, Sandra whispered into the receiver and pressed the reset button. Only now she thought of other problems, money. Jason was the main earner in their family. He paid the rent and bought groceries. Sandra's income was barely enough to make ends meet. Everything else was on Jason's strong and reliable shoulders. So what now? Disaster. Where's the money for food and rent? I'll probably need medication too. Jason will need to be treated, rehabilitated. Where are we going to get the money? The debt on the lorry, the furniture, it must be a fortune. What about them? They don't even have anything to sell. And Emily will be born soon enough. Tears spurted from Sandra's eyes. She sank helplessly to the steps of the hospital porch. And then, immediately a searing pain pierced her stomach, so much so that Sandra's eyes went black. Then it seemed to go away, but a moment later it happened again. Sandra wrapped her arms around her stomach and froze on the porch. The pain came in waves. Sandra could no longer think about Jason or the money problems that their family was facing. Nothing mattered as long as the infernal pain went away. Sandra called for help with all her might. People in white coats, a gurney, the bright light of the lamp in the operating theater. Sandra was asked some questions. She answered, sometimes clearly out of order. Then someone put a mask over her face and asked her to count from 10 to 1. Sandra concentrated and started counting. Soon there was blissful darkness and calmness came. Sandra felt she was floating in something soft and gentle. Most importantly, the excruciating pain was gone. No thoughts, no worries, no fears. Just peace and quiet. Sandra was even a little upset when she opened her eyes and found herself in a bright hospital room. Her mouth was terribly dry. Her tongue felt like it was glued to her palate. An unpleasant sensation. Sandra was lying under an IV. Some wires were attached to her chest. The girl felt a strange lightness in her whole body. She grabbed her stomach. There was no stomach. How is this possible? Sandra had a cold sweat on her forehead from fear and anxiety. "Hello, anyone?" Sandra shouted with all her might, but her voice sounded quiet, barely audible. The patient was noticed, though. A woman in a white coat, either a doctor or a nurse, entered the room at her call. "Where is my baby?" Sandra asked the question on the answer to which her whole life depended. She had never felt such fear before. "Your baby girl is in the room for premature babies. She's alive." A hospital employee rushed to reassure the patient. "You went into premature labor out of nervousness. It's good that you were in the hospital at the time. You got help quickly." "Is she alive?" Sandra checked again. "Yes, she's alive. She's a good girl, strong, but she has to be raised in a hospital setting. She was premature. I've seen a lot of babies like that. This one's going to be fine. No, she's going to need rehab, of course, not without it. But the baby's not critical. Don't worry." Sandra nodded her head gratefully. The main thing was that Emily was alive. The young mother immediately believed the words of the woman in the white coat. Her daughter was really going to be all right. Ironically, the woman who later helped Sandra with the pram also had a baby that day. Also premature. But unlike Sandra, she had heard a very different prognosis from the doctors. Her baby was given no chance. Can I see my daughter?" "That's for later. You're too weak yourself right now. You've lost a lot of blood. And anyway, we all know what happened to your husband. Of course you're nervous about having a premature birth." "And my husband? Do you know if there's any news about him?" "I know he's alive in intensive care. That's all I know." And anxious days flowed, filled with fear for her daughter and husband. Injections, pills, painful procedures. Sandra felt her strength returning. That was a good thing, because she would need her strength. She will now have a disabled husband and a newborn daughter who requires intensive care due to prematurity. After all, money problems have not canceled. Can Sandra cope with all this alone? The nursing staff, knowing the story of the young mum, tried to support her in any way they could. They told her every day about Jason's condition. The man had already been moved out of intensive care. He even started to move his arms to speak and learned to sit up. But walking was much worse. All indications were that Jason would never get out of his wheelchair. Emily. Things were really good. She was growing, getting stronger, and most importantly, gaining weight. Sandra was taken to see her daughter on the third day after the baby girl was born. Emily lay in her cot, so small, so defenseless. Her tiny body was tangled with wires. And yet, compared to her peers, the girl looked the strongest. There were also babies who were born much earlier than they should have been. Emily was still 7 months in the womb. Sandra was soon released from the hospital, but the woman still came here every day to visit Emily and Jason and check on their condition with the doctors. Jason fought bravely. It hurt to see a young and once strong husband in a wheelchair. But he assured that he would get well soon and take up his work with renewed vigor. Because no more sickness and idleness, he looked at Emily's photos with a snowy smile. "I can't wait to get back on my feet and see my daughter. I'll carry her around the park on my shoulders and learn to braid her hair." Sandra smiled sadly. From what the doctor had told her, Jason was unlikely to get up. There was a chance, but it would take a lot of money to rehabilitate him. Where was that going to come from? Thank the doctors so much, she thought. They'd help Jason get disability quickly, which meant Social Security benefits and at least some free medical care. But all of that was not enough for Jason's full recovery. And then the owner of the truck called every day demanding money. Sandra even had to go back to work. Now she cleaned the entrances in the mornings and evenings. It was money, no matter what. She had plenty of time for now. Emily was in the hospital. Another month or so passed, and then Jason was released from the hospital. He came home in a wheelchair. It's a good thing they had ramps in their driveway, but it was inconvenient enough. Yes, it was hard for Jason to get used to his new situation, but he was not discouraged and supported Sandra, and he looked for a job, surfing the internet in search of income for people who couldn't walk. There were very few jobs. And then, finally, Emily was discharged. The joy of the young parents was unrivaled, despite the seemingly hopeless situation. Jason quickly learned how to manipulate the baby to bathe, feed, and change nappies. Seeing that the young father was doing quite well, Sandra decided to go to work. "We don't have enough money, and you can still cope with the baby at home. I'll go back to the canteen. There's no other way out." Jason had to agree. I could see for myself that it was very hard on him. He'd been the main breadwinner for so long, and now he was sitting on his wife's neck. But the young family really had no choice. They had to pay the rent, pay for food, pay off debt. The money that Jason had been saving for a couple of years for a future place to live had gone at a cosmic speed. Some of it went to medication, some of it to pay off the cost of the truck. It was a tough time. Sandra was at work 24 hours a day, working double shifts. Jason was doing the best he could at home. It wasn't easy for him either. Emily was growing up sickly, the effects of prematurity. She needed medicines, expensive vitamins, endless consultations and specialist examinations. Sandra was struggling. Jason, too, looked exhausted. He took part-time jobs earning pennies, but he couldn't do nothing either. Emily was all over him. Only the head of the family, Jason, didn't think it was enough. And still the money was woefully inadequate. Even a pram for Emily was not enough to buy, and she needed it to take her to the clinic. One evening, Sandra was coming home from work. Her back was already aching and her legs were buzzing with fatigue. Heavy thoughts were swarming in her head. This was not how Sandra had imagined married life. In her dreams, she saw herself strolling through the park with a pram and a smart baby in it. Sandra often looked at such young mothers. They are walking calm, peaceful, happy, and do not even realize how lucky they are. They are lucky that they can walk freely with their babies and devote all their time to them. Emily doesn't even have a pram. Suddenly, Sandra's attention was caught by a woman walking towards her with a lovely coffee-colored pram. Comfortable, maneuverable, obviously very expensive and high quality. Sandra had seen them in children's shops. They cost a fortune. Sandra gave the woman a habitual glance. Something about the stranger caught her eye. So stylish, well-groomed. Old, of course. But nowadays many people have their first child, especially the rich. It's fashionable. But why is this woman so sad? Maybe something happened in her life. Something terrible must have happened to her. There's no other way to explain that look in her eyes. After all, she seems to be doing well. She's so beautiful. She's rolling an expensive pram in front of her. There's probably a baby in it, dressed in brand-name clothes. The woman rolled the pram up to a car park with rubbish bins. The rubbish hadn't been emptied for a long time. A sort of spontaneous dump had formed here. Sandra thought that maybe the woman would throw the bag of rubbish away and move on. But the stranger did otherwise. She sighed, rocked the pram a few times, and walked away. With a quick step, the woman walked behind the house somewhere far away, and the pram stayed where it was. Sandra, not believing her eyes, hurried to the rubbish bins. The first thing she did was look in the pram. There was no one there. Sandra exhaled. She had already decided that some crazy person had thrown the baby into a rubbish bin. Such cases are sometimes described on the internet. But the pram, fortunately, turned out to be empty. Why would a stranger leave it here? She probably threw it away. People sometimes leave good things near the rubbish for people in need to pick up. Like this woman, her baby must be all grown up by now. So she got rid of her now unwanted pram. Yes, that was the most reasonable explanation. But Sandra tried not to rejoice just yet. What if the woman comes back now? What if she just left the pram here while she went to run errands or fetch the baby? Strange choice of location, sure, but I don't know. Half an hour passed. The woman still hadn't turned up. Sandra had been watching the pram all this time, because what if someone else took it? A thing like that wouldn't stay near the rubbish bins. And they need the pram so much for Emily, it's a must. In the end, Sandra is sure that the owner does not need the pram and calmly rolls it to her house. Jason even whistled in amazement when he saw it. This is how Emily is transported. And what a luxury vehicle it is. I'm surprised myself, Sandra smiled. The woman left it on the rubbish bin right in front of me and walked away. I was still waiting a long time, in case she came back. But no, she didn't come back. It's strange. Such a beautiful pram, obviously expensive. I could have sold it. I'd make a lot of money. It's in perfect condition, like new, Sandra agreed. Strange, like new indeed, Jason shook his head, examining the tires carefully. Oh well, you can't understand them rich people. Jason volunteered to wash the pram himself, which was why he had discovered the very letter. A piece of paper folded in half was in the side pocket of the pram. It was a whole message. "Come here," Jason called to his wife. She was playing with Emily at that moment. "It's just I can't believe it." Read it. Jason held out the sheet to his wife. "Where did you get this?" "It was lying in the pram. I don't even know how to respond to it. It's a terrific letter." Sandra took the piece of paper from her husband's hands and began to read. Beautiful, almost calligraphic handwriting, easy to read. It was clearly written by a very literate person. What's the point? Yeah, Jason's right. It's a pretty unbelievable story. "Hello, people who found this letter," the message began. "If you're reading this, it means the prom has finally met its little master or mistress. That's just wonderful. My name is Tiffany. I decided to leave the pram near the bins so that it could go to people in need, people with a baby who don't have any money for baby transport. May the prom last a long time and help you raise your child. Of course, you are people with low income, perhaps even living on the edge of poverty. There are all sorts of situations. Why am I so sure of that? Simply because it's unlikely that someone from a wealthy family would pick up a pram in a landfill. Such people prepare for the arrival of a child in advance, make lists, choose things in children's shops. I was just as happy a while ago. But you're happier than I am, because you have the main thing: your child, your son or daughter. It is happiness to be parents, to see your baby growing, to give him love, to introduce him to the world. I don't know what could be better than that. Probably nothing, so you're much happier than I am. You're going through a hard time right now, but I'm sure you'll get through it. You'll be fine in the end. Let this wheelchair be a help to you on your start to success." It's like she's describing as Sandra said in amazement as she looked at Jason. Exactly, agreed her husband. That's what's so amazing about it. But go ahead and read on. There's a lot of interesting stuff in there, especially at the end. Sandra delved into the reading again. "My life has been a fairy tale in which all my wishes have come true. Since I was a child, I have never been denied anything. My father is a successful businessman, my mother a successful financier. I was the only granddaughter of my mom and dad's grandparents. You can imagine how they spoiled me, how much love, care, and attention I received. They invested a lot in me, and I knew that the moment would come and I would pass it all on to my children. Since I was little, I dreamed of a big family, and in games with my girlfriends, I always took on the role of a mother with many children. Since childhood, I heard from everyone that I will be a great mother when the time comes. So I grew up with that thought. And then I grew up. It turned out that life is very bright, diverse, interesting. We traveled a lot with my parents, with friends. It's something completely different. In general, I had a happy student life. I had time to live abroad and visit different parts of the world. I had adventures. As they say, it will be something to remember in my old age. It was a very cheerful period of my life, bright, full of events. And then I got interested in playing on the stock exchange. Somehow it happened that I became a successful broker, though I never aspired to it. I thought I would get married and have children, as I dreamed. Someday I would start a family. But I didn't. Work took me over completely. The excitement, the success, the recognition of reputable financiers. I was invited to conduct seminars in major business centers. Business sharks listened to my words. It all made my head spin. I didn't notice how my priorities changed. Of course, sometimes I thought that it was time to get married and become a mom. Time is running out. But on the one hand, I was still young. On the other hand, there was no one I saw as my spouse. Maybe those were just excuses, because I was happy with the life I was leading. Because when I looked at my friends who were mired in childish affairs and problems, I rejoiced in my freedom. The once cheerful and energetic girls had turned into haggard women. They only talked about children and their skills. It made me sad. I felt like a queen. Successful, respected, indispensable. Famous economists sought my advice, magazines wrote about me. It's a feeling I can't describe. This glitter and tinsel overshadowed for me my main desire. I always wanted to have children. I wanted to take care of babies, to teach them something, to love them. But at that time, for some reason, I decided that motherhood is the fate of lazy, limited housewives. I even condemned women who were completely immersed in children, considered them too down to earth, not capable of anything but childbearing. I almost stopped talking to my family friends. Their children annoyed me. I don't know how it happened. What are you, a child free? Lingered a question that one of my acquaintances once asked me. She had recently given birth to a son and could think of nothing but her child. I wondered. No, not a child-free person. It's just that at that time I didn't want to burden myself with all this. I mean, it's nice not to have to depend on anyone, to be free and easy. I wanted to go to the seaside with friends. I wanted to go clubbing or shopping. I wanted to start a new romance and plunge headlong into a beautiful relationship. It seemed to me that I would still have time to become a mother sometime in the future, after many years. For now, my life was bright and exciting as it was. And then somehow I got bored with it all. Work, risk, superficial novels, clubs, drinking, dancing, even traveling. I wanted a family warmth, a reliable person next to me. I guess the time had come. True, I was already 35 at the time. I remembered my old dream of becoming a mother of many children. Now I looked at my married friends not with contempt and regret, but almost with envy. I too wanted it all. Husband, children, family. Then came the realization that work and recognition will not replace the warmth of loved ones. Even tears came to my eyes at these thoughts. I grew up, I guess. And that's when I met Scott. A chance meeting at a coffee shop where we both had breakfast before work. We had what they call a spark. We looked at each other at first. Then he came over. Young lady, Scott said, "I can't take my eyes off you. You're incredibly beautiful, and your eyes are so amazing. I can see in them that you are a very kind, caring person." It was nice to receive such an exquisite compliment, especially from a man you liked at first sight. But I hastened to disappoint him. "You are not a very good judge of character," I said. "You don't know me at all, and you thought I was kind and good. I'm not." "You don't seem to know yourself very well," Scott smiled. "I'm a good judge of character, and I'm never wrong. You'll find that out." Then we got to talking. I was immediately interested in Scott. He was so smart, so perceptive, and most importantly, he looked at me with admiration and tenderness. That's how our relationship began. 6 months later, we were already celebrating a lavish wedding. He turned out to be the owner of a small dairy. What won me over most of all was his sense of humor. And a caring mother, of course. He finally made me feel like a woman in the full sense of the word. It turns out that it is very pleasant when you are looked after, when you are protected. Of course, we did not put off the question of heirs, as both of us were already at the age when it was time to become parents. Turns out he dreams of a large family, just as I once did around Scott. That childhood dream of mine came alive again. I realized that more than anything I wanted to be a mom, and as soon as possible. And that's when I found out it wasn't that simple. I couldn't get pregnant. For the first time in my life, I couldn't get what I wanted. It was discouraging. Scott told me not to worry. He told me about people he knew who hadn't become parents right away. But it didn't make me feel any better. I snapped at my husband, even though I loved him very much. He patiently endured all my tantrums. I still don't understand where he got so much strength. After a while, we went to the doctors. At first, they couldn't make a diagnosis for a long time. Scott and I were given a full examination. There were no problems with money, so we visited the most famous doctors both in our country and abroad. After a while, the doctors found the cause of the problem. It turned out that there was a subtle genetic breakdown in my health, which was almost impossible to detect. But also how to correct the situation, the doctors had no idea. If I had decided on motherhood earlier, everything would have worked out. But the years in my case played against me. I was immediately warned that the chances were practically nil, and then I enthusiastically joined the fight. I was not used to giving up and losing in anything. I took the doctor's words as a challenge. And again, treatment, examinations, endless analyses and procedures. I stopped working. I no longer enjoyed anything at all. I had a goal, and I was on my way to it. How can that be? My dream, and suddenly it doesn't come true. I just couldn't get my head around that. There was a period when I began to hate women with small children and pregnant women, just because I was so jealous of them. Why did they get it and I didn't? It's so unfair. Why are they better than me? I'd have been a much better mother. Cattle was so patient with me. He comforted me, supported me. My husband said many times that all he wanted was for me to come back the same old me, cheerful, kind, cheerful. I miss my Tiffany incredibly. It's been so long since I've been in touch with this intelligent, sensitive woman. Go find that woman, I replied resentfully. If your wife doesn't suit you anymore. Why are you doing this? Scott sighed and hugged me. I just miss our old life. I'd love to help him, but I'm so fixated on what's unattainable for me. I've lost my mind. Let's adopt a baby, Scott urged. There are so many kids in orphanages who need parents. They've been betrayed from birth, abandoned and forsaken. We have a lot of opportunities. We'll give that child or those children everything they need to be happy. Think about it. Just think about it. He even showed me pictures of orphans from orphanages. Big-eyed babies, touching, defenseless, so in need of loving and caring adults by their side. But I didn't want to hear anything. I needed my own blood child. What do I need other people's children for? Their parents don't even want them. So what do we need them for? Imagine whose offspring end up in an orphanage. Lazy, alcoholics, don't be daft. We'll work it out in the end. But nothing worked out. Doctors were throwing up their hands and saying more and more often that genetic diagnoses were very difficult to work with. Treatment became more and more expensive and more difficult. The outlook was increasingly dim. I spent 5 years trying to have a baby. It was a very difficult time. There was hope and disappointment all over the place. I lived in anxiety, then in the pain of another failure. The cattle. How did he have so much patience? He was always there to support me, even though I was acting crazy. From time to time, my husband talked about having a foster baby, but I didn't want to hear anything. It was as if his persuasion spurred me on. Now, I also wanted to prove him wrong. We're having our own baby. Because I said so. He's offering me some nonsense. I've tried everything. I've tried innovative methods. I've tried folk medicine. I even went to a healer. The shaman was running around me, shouting strange words. I smoked all over the room. I smoked everything. But even then, I thought I was doing the right thing. Knocking on every door, taking every chance. Temporary blackout, no other way to put it. Scott looked at me with regret and concern. He was afraid for my condition, because I didn't look like myself at all. And then, finally, a miracle. One May morning, I learned that I was expecting a child. I was overjoyed. I even fainted from the abundance of emotions. I looked at the positive test and my legs were shaking. Finally. How I wanted at that moment to speed up time, to make this happy event come sooner. My long-awaited baby boy was born. There were still months ahead, but I already felt like his mother. The doctors were surprised at the time. According to them, there was no hope. But my case turned out to be a miracle. I naively believed that everything worked out because my desire was so strong and it changed the world and the order of things in it. And then I found myself almost omnipotent. The cattle, of course, were very happy too. I felt a kind of superiority over him. How he'd been going on and on about foster children. He had tried to reconcile me to our situation, and in the end, he was wrong. I was happy about that too. It's embarrassing to write that now. Readers, forgive me for describing everything in such detail here now. It is necessary, perhaps, to speak out. I want someone to know about my fate, to understand my feelings. Yes, read all the way to the end. Look, there's something very interesting and important waiting for you. I really want to help you and your baby, not only financially, but also with advice. My life. Make the right conclusions and do not repeat my mistakes. Appreciate what you have. Pregnancy was difficult from the very beginning. Constant threats of miscarriage. I didn't leave the hospital for months, sometimes weeks. I was lying in bed, not getting out of bed at all, taking care of my baby. My health was deteriorating sharply. Doctors offered me to get rid of the pregnancy because the analyses said that the body could not cope with the load. My life was in danger. After all, I had a serious diagnosis that I could not give birth to. I didn't want to listen to anything. I had to dream of pregnancy for so long, waiting for this moment for so long, and suddenly giving up on a lined-up baby. No way. You are doctors and you are paid a lot of money to do your job, I shouted at the nursing staff. Then do it properly. It's only a few months away. It's the 21st century. Is medicine so powerless these days? My doctors used to say. Yes, you're right, doctors are gods. Are you suffering? The child suffers. The consequences could be catastrophic. There are no guarantees. You have to understand that. But I didn't want to hear any of it. By then I already knew I was carrying my son. I'd even dreamt about him many times. For the sake of this baby, I was ready to endure any pain and to lie in hospital, even for the whole 9 months. I needed a child, and that was it. The fact that the baby suffered in the womb, not adapted for carrying children, I did not even think about it. That's how selfish I was back then. Cattle, seeing that I could not change my mind, was there for me and just supported me. He didn't argue anymore, so as not to make me nervous. He agreed with everything, held my hand, reassured me, bought all the necessary drugs, talked to the doctors. Just a hug when I needed it. I was getting worse. I hoped that the baby was suffering less, but according to the ultrasound, it was also very, very bad. I was so scared for my baby boy. He was the meaning of my life. I was talking to my son, asking him to hang in there to distract myself somehow. I was surfing baby stuff websites, looking at prams, choosing clothes for my boy. It was such a pleasant hassle. We had parcels coming home to us, lots and lots of them. Looking at these things, I thought about good things because, well, here they are, the proof that Scott and I are almost parents. There's so much baby stuff in the house, we just have to wait for their little owner. He's going to be the happiest baby in the world. And the difficulties will be forgotten like a bad dream. The boy was born much prematurely. The doctor's manipulations didn't help. The organism decided to get rid of what was destroying my health and harming me. The baby turned out to be weak, sickly. I saw his thin arms and legs, some strange, bright skin color. My heart sank with pity and tenderness. Only looking at my son wrapped in wires, I realized that I was a complete egoist. The doctors had warned me this would happen. And now I'm much better. My health is recovering rapidly. The child is bad. He is all alone in the intensive care unit, fighting for his life. The doctors said right away that there was little hope. Congenital abnormalities, general weakness of the baby due to the fact that my pregnancy was hard. But I still believed in a miracle. I even threatened the doctors that if anything they would retaliate. Of course that didn't help. My son struggled for a few days, then gave up after all. When they told me that, my world turned upside down. I was so angry at everyone, blaming the doctors, even Scott. He, in my opinion, didn't have enough faith in the happy outcome, and therefore was to blame too. It got to the point where Scott put me in a clinic. Padded room, helpful staff. Talking to a therapist. Silence, rest, medication. I began to slowly come round, rethink things and realize things. I realized what had happened. Selfish people are fixated on what they want. I realized how badly I'd behaved towards Scott. I thought about the future. I didn't know what I was going to do, but I realized that I needed to channel my energy not into anger and hatred, but into creation. That's when the conversation with my husband came back to my mind. Scott was right. There are so many underprivileged children in the world. You have to help them. You have to support them. Just because you don't have a baby of your own doesn't mean you have no one to give your unsold love and care to. I returned home a different person. The cattle were the most excited about it. He said he missed the old Tiffany so much, and now she's back with him. It was really nice. Things that reminded me of the tragedy that had happened to us, which I had bought in myriad ways: clothes, toys, furniture. Cattle put them in a separate room, a kind of warehouse or museum. These things, looking at them, still pained me deeply. Let's throw it away, I said to my husband. Why? Wouldn't it be better to give them away to the needy, he wondered. The cattle, as always, were right. I started traveling to shelters with boxes and bags. There I got acquainted with the staff, learnt the stories of the children. Lots and lots of stories, complicated fates, tragedies, betrayals. Someday, when I have more time, I will write a book about it. People need to know this. It fascinated me. I wanted to help underprivileged kids, to make their lives a little better. And I could. I had all the opportunities, and now I think to organize my own charitable foundation. It's a lot of work, but I can do it. I've already started to learn a little bit about how to set it up. In the meantime, I help kids from orphanages, buying things they need and organizing holidays. I am so happy to see smiles on the faces of these boys and girls. Some time past, it seemed to me that I gave away all the things that I bought for my son, but one day I came across this pram. I remembered how carefully I chose it, studied the features, looked at the appearance. I wanted my son to be comfortable in it. But unfortunately, he never had time to try it out. The pram was stored in the basement. That's why Scott and I had forgotten about it. He tensed up when I noticed the thing, thinking I was going to get hurt again. But strangely enough, all I felt was a slight sadness. Regret, because I already had meaning in my life again. And I knew that my baby, what had happened to him, it wasn't all for nothing. Now, in honor of my son, I will help many other children. Our boy didn't live long, but his short life will make a huge difference in this world. But what about the pram? I had a very interesting idea about it. Orphanages where children have a hard life. Everyone knows about it. They often talk about it, but at least they are provided for, always fed and clothed. They lack parental love and care. At the same time, they are fully provided for financially. But there is another category of children. Their parents earn pennies and cannot buy them even the most necessary things. How many such families do we have? Usually nobody helps them. There are mom and dad, let them raise their heirs. That's what most people think. But there are different situations. Not only lazy and irresponsible people get into difficult situations. I decided to leave this pram where it will be found by people who need it badly. Usually good things that are no longer needed are left near the rubbish. That's what I did with the pram. Thank you for reading this story to the end. I hope my letter eventually found the right recipient. I believe it did. You must be desperate right now. You don't have enough money to live on? You don't see a future. So I want to help you with something else. Not far from the rubbish bins where you found the pram, there's an unfinished shop building, an abandoned property. I left something else under the porch there for you. I hope it will help you get your life together and raise your baby to be a decent human being. Good luck with everything. Tiffany. Sandra set the sheet aside in confusion and looked at Jason. Do you think this is all true? She asked Jason. You mean about something waiting for us under the porch of the unfinished building? And about that, too. And about the whole thing in general, she clarified. I don't know what to think, Jason shrugged. But I'm definitely going to look under the porch right now. I don't feel like waiting until morning. The young parents put Emily to bed. They waited until she was snoring sweetly in her cot before they went outside. They were not worried about their daughter. They knew that she now sleeps at least 4 hours in a row, and they do not need so much time. The unfinished building was very close. They could do it in 20 minutes. This is the place, Jason said as he wheeled his buggy up to the porch of the unfinished shop. He bent down and started fumbling under the porch with his hands. Sandra was standing nearby, afraid of something. She looked around, wondering if this was some kind of prank or worse. What if they were being set up? What if right now there was someone watching them from around the corner? Look, Jason exclaimed, pulling out a small roll frozen in cellophane. The boy immediately tore open the wrapping and whistled in surprise. Sandra looked at what he was holding out to her. It was a thick wad of notes, lots and lots of money. Sandra even pinched her hand to make sure it wasn't a dream. There was a fortune in here. Maybe not, the girl doubted. Yeah, no, it looks like the real thing, Jason said, examining the notes closely. So everything in this letter is true from the first to the last word. Unbelievable. Sandra still couldn't believe it, couldn't believe that strangers had saved their family from imminent disaster. But that's how it turned out in the end. The money was enough to rehabilitate Jason. The young man was quickly put back on his feet in a paid medical center. Now he could work again. It's true what they say: if you want to make a man happy, first take something away from him, and then give it back. Jason rejoiced. He was walking at last. It took a long time to learn how to do it. It didn't all work at once. Daddy and daughter took their first steps together. One from the moment of birth, the other after the accident. The young people also had enough to buy their own flat. A small 2-bedroom in an unprestigious area of the city, but it was their own cozy native beloved. With what pleasure the young made repairs in their nest and arranged it. Yes, the money found under the porch was enough for the new place. Jason was working again, so the family was no longer in poverty. Sandra was able to finish her maternity leave in peace. Now she didn't have to work from dawn to dusk in the canteen. What a blessing it was to watch your child grow up, to introduce him to the world, to devote time to him without thinking about how to survive. Jason paid off his debt to his former employer and found a new job. Now he wasn't working multiple shifts and was much more careful and cautious than before. Life was getting better. One day Sandra was walking in the park with her pram, the same lovely coffee-colored pram. It was designed to be converted into a seated vehicle. In the pram, Emily, wearing a light white dress and a smart hat, wiggled her legs and looked at the world in wonder. She looked like a doll. And Sandra suddenly caught herself thinking that she was now that happy young mother, one of those she had once envied so much. And it was all thanks to Tiffany. A woman who had survived a tragedy, but had managed to overcome herself and find her true calling. Tiffany is probably now helping other orphans and poor children. It's wonderful that there are people like that in the world. As the years passed, Jason and Sandra worked, raising Emily. They weren't poor anymore, just an ordinary, middle-class family. Even managed to get away to the seaside once in a while, all thanks to the occasional help from complete strangers. Sandra tried to look for Tiffany, scouring the internet, looking at many pages on social networks. Why? But just wanted to say to the person who had done so much for their family's future. Thank you, just a simple thank you. Let Tiffany know that her pram and money really did save an entire family. It would probably make her feel good. But Sandra soon realized that Tiffany apparently lived in a different town altogether, because no one supervised the local shelters. And there was no children's aid fund in their town either. Some kind of fairy, Jason said. He, too, wanted to find their savior. She'd come out of nowhere at a difficult moment, and then vanished without a trace. It's mystical, our guardian angel, that's what it is. Years passed. Emily grew up to be a pretty girl. She always got excellent grades. Her parents were proud of their daughter and very much hoped that she, unlike them, will definitely be able to get a good education. They both encouraged Emily to go to university. The girl herself was not against it. Since the 3rd grade, she dreamed of becoming a teacher. Of course, Emily knew the story of the pram. Her parents told their daughter about it when she was about 5 years old. Every day, Sandra remembered the woman who had left the expensive new pram near the rubbish bin. Her face was clearly etched in Sandra's memory. It was Tiffany, about whom she had just read the article. This was the amazing fairy who had helped their family out of poverty. Doubts, of course, still remained. So Sandra started looking for information about the accidental savior. She wanted to know for sure. There were plenty of articles on the internet about this woman. Her foundation had done a great job. 1,000 children had received great support over the years. Tiffany didn't just help children. She attracted the powerful to the cause. Famous actors, businessmen, they all participated. Tiffany repeatedly emphasized in interviews that she could never have done it alone. The world is not without kind people, she told a journalist with a smile. There are far more kind people than indifferent and callous ones. I know that for a fact now. Tiffany looked happy, full of vigor, content with life. Her shining eyes had nothing in common with the wan look of the woman Sandra remembered. It was understandable back then Tiffany, if that was her, was going through a tragedy. Now the woman had found herself and was dealing with an important and very responsible matter. Should I write her or not? Sandra said aloud. Too bad Jason is away on a business trip. I'd like to consult with him now. Sandra was used to discussing all important matters with her husband. The woman decided to find out a little more about Tiffany to see if it was worth bothering such a busy man. Tiffany had a busy and colorful life. She traveled extensively both across the country and around the world. Almost always with her were her foster children, now teenagers. So different from each other. What would their fate have been if they had stayed in the orphanage? And then Sandra came across an article that shattered all her doubts, because this interview was about her too, about Sandra. It was a long article with lots of pictures. Tiffany answered the questions thoroughly without skimming over the details. "Where did it all start?" a reporter asked. "How did you decide that your calling was to help underprivileged children?" "As I said earlier, it all started after Scott and I lost our son, a long-awaited, long-suffering child," Tiffany replied. "We had been preparing for his arrival. We had so much stuff left over. I thought that these toys, nappies, cradles could be of use to someone. Our son is gone, but we can't let all this stuff go to waste. We delivered bags and boxes to shelters. It is so logical to give unwanted children's things to orphanages. They will always be useful there. Then, when I thought that I had already got rid of all the things, I saw the very pram that I had so carefully chosen for my child. It was painful, I'll admit it. But by that time, I had learned to cope with my emotions and decided that I had to help some needy family, people who had a baby, but no money for new things for the baby. I had to find a special family. Any family would not suit me. For this purpose, I even traveled to neighboring towns, looking around. I thought I was abnormal myself, but still I continued this strange occupation. Perhaps the tragedy then confused my mind. Anyway, I have no regrets. Then one day I saw a sad girl. There was so much anxiety in her eyes. Visually, it was noticeable how the fragile shoulders of the girl were pressed with a heavy weight of problems. She was walking through the park next to a guy who was traveling in a wheelchair. It was probably her husband. The girl was holding a tiny infant in her arms, cradling the baby in her arms, and it was so beautiful. But she didn't seem to realize it. There was despair in her eyes. The young man in the wheelchair was cheerful, even smiling. But I could see he was on the edge too. I followed this family. I was very attracted to them. I walked a little behind them and listened to their conversation. The guy needed expensive treatment. As I understood, something had happened to him not so long ago, and he had moved into a wheelchair and lost his income. The girl worked tirelessly at a hard job. The child, as much as he could, was taken care of by her husband himself, a profound invalid. But most importantly, they talked about the wheelchair. Tiffany continued. About the wheelchair, the reporter interjected. Yes, about the wheelchair. That became a kind of sign for me. They dreamed of a pram for their baby. That way it would be easier for the man to take the infant to the clinic. And then something clicked in my head. I realized that this was the family I had to help. But a pram that was too little. These good kids couldn't climb out of poverty on their own. They needed help at the start, and I could give it to them. Not only could, but I wanted to, because, well, how could I not? I'm sure they did the right thing with the money. Money? The journalist didn't understand. Yes, I decided to give them not only the pram, but also an amount that should have been enough for the guy's treatment, and at least a small flat. But how to do it without arousing suspicion? I thought about it for a long time. And then the plan just sort of fell into place. Tiffany pulled herself away from the screen and smiled. Wow. She was now recognizing her story from the other side. It was so interesting, so fascinating and unusual. The woman pulled the very same letter out of the photo album. Of course, Sandra and Jason had kept the message. Tiffany had written it years ago. She so sincerely wanted to help a family in distress. I wrote the future owners of the pram a whole message on a sheet of paper on both sides. In it, I told them about my life, about the history of the pram. It was like psychotherapy for me. It was as if I was getting rid of, spilling out my pain and healing. At the end of the letter, I told this young couple where to look for money. I hoped that everything worked out well for them. I really wanted to know the fate of this family, and even went to that town on purpose, but I never met any of them in the park. Maybe they'd gone somewhere else. Or did we just miss each other? We're really doing fine, Sandra whispered directly into the monitor. Thanks to you, we're really doing fine. But why didn't you just give them the money the journalist didn't understand? I can't remember now. I was in such a strange state at the time. Perhaps I didn't want these people to get tense or scared. After all, my story is not simple, and the situation itself could seem suspicious. In any case, I wanted to remain a mysterious stranger for this family, a kind fairy. But it's almost a legendary story. I'm sure it will be passed down in that family from generation to generation, almost like a fairy tale. A fairy tale, Sandra smiled. It is. Emily thought for a long time that they were actually helped by a fairy. It turns out the meeting wasn't a coincidence. Tiffany knew in advance that the pram and the money would go to them, and yet there were plenty of happy coincidences in this story. After all, Tiffany had come to their town looking for the right family. It was to their town that she had met them in the park, following them around. Surely they must have attracted attention then. A strange trio, a young, confused woman, a tiny infant, and a guy in a wheelchair. Tiffany spotted them, followed them. She heard bits and pieces of conversation between the couple and was strengthened in her decision to help them. Sandra didn't think any further. She was already writing a message to Tiffany. It was long, almost like that memorable letter from the pram. Sandra told the woman her story of poverty in detail. She mentioned the despair of the car accident, the disability of the sole breadwinner, the birth of her premature daughter, the huge debts. Tiffany needs to know that her help really did save an entire family. At the end, Sandra wrote about her life today and even attached photos of her family, including one from a seaside holiday. "There are no words to express our gratitude," was how Sandra ended her letter. The woman reread the message again and pressed the send button.